Chapter 49-45. Every sword intent he released was enough to easily kill any fairy bone. Millions of sword intent originate from swordsmanship and go round and round endlessly. Even after killing all the immortal bones in front of him, he didn't expend too much effort. This is a road to the bones of immortality, and I don't know how many immortals fell here to cast it. Although the army of 100,000 immortal bones had been revived, Jian Wushuang knew that this was just the beginning. This river and bones road hidden under the imperial city seems to have not been open for countless years, full of an unspeakable ancient prohibition. Jian Wushuang was alone, stepping on the broken fairy bones under his feet, and marching towards the deepest part of the White Bone Road. Everything has just begun. In order to prevent the occurrence of unexpected situations, he directly let the sword intent flow around his body, and once a danger approaches, he can directly react. On the road to the bones, apart from the bones whose fairy rhyme was lost, there were only treasures and true swords that were broken everywhere. They have been broken for countless years, and have long fallen asleep with their owners. The most well-preserved of these treasures are some real swords. They thrust into the ground obliquely, although the sword's edge is not sharp, but there is still a powerful force surging, as if waiting for a battle. The more he moved forward, the more Jian Wushuang felt a little unusual. The sense of ancient prohibition became stronger again. At the same time, the bones under the feet were very different from before, turning into grayish-white. It was another 100 feet of distance. Jian Wushuang saw a strange scene. In the middle of the road in front of the bones, a pile of bones made up of countless bones blocked the way forward. The gray-white broken fairy bones had already lost the slightest rhyme, but they gave Jian Wushuang an unprecedented pressure. He has an intuition that there is something dangerous in this pile of bones. If he follows his character, he will certainly not move forward, but the current situation has forced him to move forward. Stepping into the realm of bone piles, a violent storm erupted in an instant. In the next moment, the pile of bones as high as 10,000 feet shattered suddenly, and a dark arm that looked like a real dragon came out of it and slammed heavily towards the location of Jian Wushuang. Jian Wushuang was taken aback. Although all these changes came too fast, he still expected it. With his arms crossed and supported, he actually received the blow of the sky. Boom! He snorted, and the fairy body flew upside down 100 meters away in an instant. The bones of the earth were plowed by his leg's too deep gully, and his body shape was stopped, forcibly holding back the qi and blood tumbling in the fairy body. Jian Wushuang looked forward with solemn eyes. The pile of bones as high as 10,000 feet has fallen down like a mountain, and the two black arms that look like real dragons pushed away the countless bones, gradually revealing the true face. Seeing this scene, even Jian Wushuang was a little moved. Under the pile of white bones, there was a dark figure that was as high as 10,000 feet, like a low mountain. This pitch-black figure sits cross-legged in the middle of the White Bone Road. The whole body is extremely dark. The chest is open, the belly is big and the face is round. Especially the belly is so big that it occupies almost 2/3 of the size of the whole body, living like a fat Mithriya. The Zen clothes on his body had been ruined to the extreme, and his fat face was peculiarly shiny. 2 red lights burst out from his squinted eyes, and only greed was left in his eyes looking at Jian Wushuang. Immediately afterwards, Jian Wushuang's somewhat uncomfortable scene appeared. A series of waterfall-like saliva dripped from the mouth of the big belly Buddha, almost converging into a river. Then he opened his palms, grabbed the fairy bones scattered on both sides, stuffed them into his mouth and chewed. The weird creak resounded on the road to the bones. Jian Wushuang frowned, already quietly condensing an invisible sword. Hey, the smell of a real fairy, I haven't smelled it for a long time. The big belly Buddha let out a weird laugh, and his saliva almost turned into a river. Let me take a small bite, just a small bite. I want to eat you all, okay? Jian Wushuang didn't bother to talk nonsense with him, and the invisible sword in his hand pointed straight forward. If you can't kill me, just let me take a sip and I will let you go, okay? Datta Buddha said greedily. Die. He whispered. In order to make a quick battle, he directly used the ancestral technique. The reason why Jian Wushuang has not abandoned the ancestral technique now is because these two types of ancestral techniques have grown up and have not been online. Today's two styles of ancestral techniques are enough to match the immortal style. The ancestors, the power world Tian Men, and the heavenly gates were all released at this moment. Two magnificent heavenly gates straddled the head of the big belly Buddha, and then a giant finger and a giant palm, carrying endless power, slammed into his head fiercely. The next moment wailing resounded. The brilliance of the two ancestors directly enveloped him. The power is endless, exploding on this boneless road. The wailing of the big belly Buddha resounded across the wild. When the surviving prestige of the ancestral arts dissipated, the big and round head of the big belly Buddha had collapsed. An unknown dark liquid came out of his broken head. I want you to die. He was furious to the extreme, and strong suction suddenly burst out of his huge mouth. Jian Wushuang, who was standing hundreds of feet away, felt the suction and hurriedly swung his sword to cut away the terrible suction. Seeing that he did not draw him over, the big belly Buddha stretched out his arm of several thousand feet and smashed it. Every time he waved his arm, it was enough to shatter the space. The bones continued to collapse, the huge arm smashed down. Jian Wushuang quickly avoided. This powerful blow was enough to make ordinary Yanxian hate on the spot. Holding the invisible sword, Jian Wushuang jumped 1,000 feet in one step and boarded one of the arms of the big belly Buddha. Jia, come to my mouth. Big belly Buddha opened his huge mouth and swallowed away facing him. Jian Wushuang turned around and glanced at the giant mouth. Calm, and then the real sword in his hand suddenly pierced into his arm. Break it for me. Jian Wushuang roared in a low voice. At this moment, the million sword intent rushed into the arms of the big-bellied Buddha along the blade. The sword intent was like mountains and seas bursting out loudly. Chapter 49-46. The big-belly Buddha roared in anger, and he was extremely angry when he broke his arm. Then he slammed Jian Wushuang again with his only arm. The space was torn apart, and he quickly avoided. Looking at the big-belly Buddha who had lost his senses, Jian Wushuang's mind turned, and the next moment he directly raised his realm to the highest point. The endless Xuanhe pattern flows all over his body, and the unknown strength that surpasses the immortal is prosperous to the extreme. At this moment, Jian Wushuang was like the supreme immortal, and all the laws of heaven were crawling under his feet. Seeing this scene, even the arm that big belly Buddha smashed down has a moment of hesitation. Jian Wushuang didn't dodge or avoid, just stretched out a pointer to the front. Boom! When the two collided, the arm that looked like a real dragon was actually sealed in mid-air, making it difficult to get even an inch. A hint of uncertainty flashed in the eyes of the big belly Buddha, and he realized that he really couldn't do it. Immediately afterwards, Jian Wushuang also spoke. Let me go. I will let you die. Otherwise I can kill you with one arm. And I can kill your fairy source. Exterminate my fairy source, hee, relying on your small body? The big belly Buddha smiled and shot greedy eyes. It's not impossible to let you go. You just let me take a bite. I will let you go. Jian Wushuang snorted angrily, and the true shadow of Wu Self appeared directly behind him. The true shadow of selflessness, which can be solidified, was released by Jian Wushuang once in the void battlefield of the previous six-day realm, and it was infinitely mysterious. In an instant, the tens of thousands of feet of selfless true shadow was completely solidified, which was even 1,000 feet higher than that of the big belly Buddha. Seeing this horrible scene in front of him, the big belly Buddha, who was still laughing strangely, became stagnant, and even forgot what to do next. If you don't give way, I'm not welcome. Jian Wushuang and the huge selfless real shadow behind them both spoke at the same moment, and boundless power escaped, terrifying to the extreme. Seeing the big-bellied Buddha who had been stagnated, he secretly breathed a sigh of relief, and thought to himself that he had been shocked. However, the next moment, the originally stagnant big-bellied Buddha suddenly laughed wildly, and his remaining arms suddenly stopped the confronting Wu Self true shadow. At the same time, his extremely huge belly broke open at this moment, revealing a gluttonous mouth that could almost swallow the world. His entire belly turned out to be a mouth. Jian Wushuang's heart suddenly rises badly. He wants to remove the true shadow of Wu, but finds that everything is too late. I want to swallow you all. After big-bellied Buddha said these last words, his huge belly suddenly opened up, exposing his gluttonous mouth, and drew towards Jian Wushuang. Under this terrible suction force, the egoless true shadow, that is as high as 10 feet, can't move at this moment. A wisp of cold sweat gushed from Jian Wushuang's temples, and he never thought that this big-belly Buddha would have such a killer mace. Under this terrible suction, his very body was shaken. The immeasurable true shadow of selflessness shattered directly at this moment, turning into countless stars into the belly of the big-belly Buddha Chi Dao. Not only the disappearance of the true shadow of Wu, but also all the power in Jian Wushuang's fairy body is fading quickly. He was shocked, and instantly released his sword intent without reservation. Wushuang Kendo, Xinggehejianyini, the second style. River. The lofty Tianhe descended from the sky. This is a vast sword composed of billions of sword intents, with a powerful force that cannot be seen directly. This sword was enough to oppress 100 Yanxian, causing the heavens to tremble. But this mighty sword, an all-inclusive sword, disappeared in the next moment. It's not so much disappearing, it's more appropriate to say everything is swallowed. Weiwei Jianhe was also swallowed under the terrible suction. Jian Wushuang was completely shocked. As his strongest swordsmanship, he was disintegrated and absorbed. What is the origin of this big-belly Buddha? With the true shadow of the selflessness, the energy of the sword intent with the shape of the river was swallowed into the abdomen, and the figure of the big-belly Buddha once again exploded by thousands of feet, and the entire belly was almost exploding, and it was extremely large. Even I want to swallow. Are you not afraid to die? Jian Wushuang reluctantly stabilized his figure, angrily said, Hold me. Hey, no one can hold me. I can swallow the sky. He said with a weird smile, his face full of madness. Swallow the sky and the earth, then I will support you to death today. Jian Wushuang gritted his teeth and said coldly. This billions of strands of strength swept the bones behind him almost instantly. At this moment, the true sword that had been inserted diagonally into the ground seemed to be inspired by a certain kind, and the silent blade suddenly appeared cold. A cold light. 10 cold light. Thousands of cold light. 10,000 cold light. At this moment, all the silent real swords on Baigulu completely awakened, and each sword uttered a clear sword sound, as if it had been called by the master. Jian Wushuang stood in the void, his arms raised. As his arms lifted, all the cold light burst out, and the true sword of the 10,000 ways rose into the sky. They all hung high behind Jian Wushuang, exuding endless momentum. At this moment, he is like the master of Kendo, the lord of 10,000 swords. What Jianfeng refers to as the journey. Go with. The sword waved his palms, and tens of thousands of true swords exploded into their respective magnificent trends. They seem to be able to perceive that this is the last moment they can bloom. So the endless sword intent at this moment is simply extremely prosperous. They seem to have returned to the eve of fighting with their masters, and they screamed excitedly. Then they rushed towards the big-belly Buddha together. The vast sword intent illuminates the entire road to the bones. At this moment, Jian Wushuang became serious about it. Swords have souls. They are connected with the master's mind, and can even resonate with the soul. At this moment, they are all willing to release their peak sword in his hands. After the peak came to an end, when the sword intent reached its peak, all the true swords were broken. It was all broken into powder, and there was no possibility of repairing it. No, do not want. The sword intent is like the mountains, and the sea will pour, directly engulfing the big-belly Buddha and covering it. 10,000 extreme sword intent, finally blooming without reservation. Baigulu rolled up the dust, and even the river of blood above his head fluctuated, and it seemed that it might pour down at any time. Jian Wushuang still stood still on the spot. His eyes fluctuated a little, and finally he was calm. He looked at the place where the 10,000 sword intent bloomed, and knew from the bottom of his heart that there was no possibility of the big-belly Buddha surviving. When all the sword intent dissipated and the dust fell on the bone road, the miserable scene was immediately reflected in Jian Wushuang's eyes. Chapter 49-47. The godlike celestial body of the big-belly Buddha. has been shattered and shattered by the sword intent. The endless blood of God was almost forming a river on the bone road, and everything in sight was full of misery. Jian Wushuang took advantage of his strength and awakened all the sword intent on this white bone road, so that he could easily defeat the Big Belly Buddha with the strength of rank 6 Dian Immortal. If not, it is almost impossible to defeat it. Seeing the immortal corpses all over the floor, Jian Wushuang restrained his mind and prepared to leave. But at this moment he felt a faint breath again. The breath was faint but real, and very familiar. Jian Wushuang was slightly startled in his heart, and looked directly in that direction, only to see a miserable figure among the countless huge corpses, struggling constantly. Impossible, why is he not dead yet? He thought, hurriedly hurried back to the wreckage of the Big Belly Buddha, waved his palms flying the huge remains of the corpse. A bloody, extremely skinny figure came into his eyes. Ahem. I am finally relieved. The extremely skinny figure lay on the bone road soaked in the blood of the gods, with a voice of relief from his mouth. Jian Wushuang frowned slightly. From the clothes on his body, it could be seen that it was a worn-out Zen clothing, and there was a huge Zen beads hanging around his neck. This kind of dress, Jian Wushuang had seen it once in this great development. Even the group of great monks who destroyed the heaven where the Sand Demon Cave is located are dressed in this way. Little is known about the origin of the group of great monks, only that they come from outside the Big Division territory and are extremely terrifying existence. There were many great monks who entered the Sand Demon Cavern, but only the empty will left Jian Wushuang the deepest impression. And this skinny figure now seems to be related to the group of great monks long ago. Could it be that he also came from the so-called world of Heavenly Buddha? Jian Wushuang thought to himself, condensing an invisible sword in his hand. Ahem. The skinny figure opened his mouth and vomited a big mouthful of blood, and then collapsed on his back. Only then did Jian Wushuang see his face clearly. His face was clear and thin, like an ascetic monk. With his eyes facing each other, the monk, who was already angry, suddenly got up with all his strength and knelt down facing him. Thank you. The good man gave me relief. I can't repay the song. Jian Wushuang didn't reply, stared at him without any relaxation, and finally said slowly, Where did you come from and why are you here? With a light cough, the monk who claimed to be Shinga sat cross-legged on the road of white bones with his hands clasped together. Since the monk asked about it, Shinga will tell the reason for this. My original song came from the world of Tongtian Buddhism. I am an ascetic monk who travels in the realm of 10,000 realms and feels all kinds of suffering. Hearing this sentence, Jian Wushuang's divine mind was a little shaken. Just as he had imagined, this monk also came from the world of Tongtian Buddha. The monk named Shinga continued to say to himself, and the reason why I am here is purely because of that battle. That was the battle to destroy the old age and establish a new heaven. All living creatures fell in that battle, and the heavenly domains that belonged to the old heaven also fell. Not only did the heaven fall, but even the strongest among them died. But the strong died, but the strongest ones were not beheaded. The strongest people have been banished to a tangible and intangible, intangible and intangible place. As for that place, it is here, Shinga said, and pointed his thin palm to the ground. And I traveled there, that is, the Big Division area that was suggested later, was inadvertently involved in that war, and was eventually banished here for various reasons. Jian Wushuang heard this and said again, Then why did you become the same as before? Shinga heard the words. 2 lines of clear tears welled up from the dilapidated eye sockets, and finally he said, Greed. I relied on myself and rejected the 6 desires, but finally did not escape the control of greed. After I was banished, my mind was wounded, and then occupied by the emperor, which evoked the ultimate greed in my heart, and became a bad Buddha. If it weren't for the good men to come here and eventually destroy my evil body, I'm afraid I am trapped here forever. This short conversation was completely over. Jian Wushuang also got some secrets from Xing's words. These Dian immortals exiled in the Sea of No Edge were the strongest people in the original heavenly courts before Zhenwiang created the heavenly courts. And this is somewhat different from Jian Wushuang's guess. He thought that the exiled here where some extremely evil die in immortals. The song puts hands together, and there is relief in the dead eyes. Thank you, good man. Shinga has been liberated, but when I am about to be liberated, I want to give the good man something. As he said, his skinny palm touched the string of ring beads between his neck, and then took off the fist-sized ring beads in the middle. In an instant, all the ring beads on his neck were turned into nothingness. Only the one in his hand exuded a mysterious color. Seeing such a ring bead, Jian Wushuang remembered another thing. Under the sea of blood in the sand demon cavern, he had visited the empty chakra, and in the end he also gave him a natal ring. Good man, the song has nothing to do with it. Give this ring to the good man. Jian Wushuang did not shirk off. After a little thought, he reached out and took the ring beads in his hand. The ring beads are warm and cool, and have a unique texture. Afterwards, Jian Wushuang said, "Do you know there is an ascetic monk named Kongluan?" The line song that was about to fall. After hearing the name taboo, his eyes suddenly opened to the maximum. Empty, empty wheel? My brother, his name is Empty Wheel. Good people have seen him? How good is he? Jian Wushuang sighed secretly in his heart. Calm and then slowly said, "We have met before, and we have been discussing the forum for a few days, and it is very close. He is also an ascetic who measures the earth with his feet. I'm afraid he has passed away." Shinga shook his whole body, leaving 2 lines of clear tears in his eyes again, and did not make any excessive actions. After a while he whispered, "It's fine, it's time for me." As his voice fell, the thin fairy body returned directly to nothingness, flowing out of the stars, and finally all scattered on this bone road. A rank 6 Dian fairy fell. Jian Wushuang was silent, looking at the black ring bead in his hand, and threw it into the Bo Yang bottle. Chapter 49-48. With the fall of the big-bellied Buddha and Xing sitting and passing away, the road to the bones became unimpeded again, and the front was revealed in Jian Wushuang's eyes. Containing his mind, he continued to walk forward firmly. The road to the bones is endless, and the road to the foot has an end. Jian Wushuang's feet stepped on the sword intent for millions of miles. Under this sea of blood, running freely on the road of bones, no immortal could stop him. Leaving the realm of the original Big Belly Buddha, the wicked and greedy meaning in the bone road ahead disappeared, replaced by the aura of ancient prohibition, full of unknown. At the same time, the road of the bones under the feet began to turn gray-black, and most of the scattered bones were intact. They seemed to wake up at any time when they fell asleep. Jian Wushuang's heart rose with a sense of vigilance, and at the same time, he directly condensed the overflowing power and swept forward with the whole body sword intent. A withered and cold aura quietly surged from the whole body, very strange and somewhat familiar. In the next moment, a ray of extreme cold light suddenly bloomed from the road of bones, and instantly shot Jian Wushuang directly. He had been alert for a long time, with 5 fingers, and suddenly shot a Yanli Huamang. Boom! When Yanli Huamang wiped out the extreme cold glow at Nirvana, he blasted towards the bone road, and directly set off a wave of dust. What exudes the extreme cold glow is a pitch-black fairy bone holding a real sword. While Jian Wushuang destroyed him, his figure didn't stop, and he shot straight ahead. But everything has changed. As he walked forward, the tens of thousands of feet of dust slowly came to an end, and then countless rays of dark red light burst out. The fairy bones lying on their backs on the road of white bones all recovered at this moment, and their empty eye sockets were now replaced by the dark red dead light. Kill! At the forefront of the revived bone army, a white bone that resembled a sacred peak was several tens of feet high. He held a broken real sword and pointed straight at Jian Wushuang in front of him. In the next moment, all the bones swarmed forward, terrifying to the extreme. Jian Wushuang secretly said something bad. Looking at the army of white bones behind him, he realized something. The bones in this new round of resuscitation carried a deadly energy that was extremely heavy, just like the dead immortal in the dead immortal domain where the cloud was located. They barely retained some consciousness, desperately eager for the power of evolving immortals. And there is a source of immortality in their bodies that is about to be broken. Their strength is not to be underestimated. And it is extremely tricky. Right now, this army of dead immortals is endless. If Jian Wushuang doesn't escape as soon as possible, I'm afraid he will be besieged. However, the energy bursting out of these dead immortals was far beyond his imagination. Almost at the same time, just like the Tianhe swept across, these dead immortal armies that still preserved their respective immortal sources have been besieged from all sides to Jian Wushuang. Damn, what are these things? He was astonished, and at the same time released a million sword intent without hesitation. But the thing that surprised him was still behind. These dead immortals who chased him would actually avoid sword intent, instead of letting them be slaughtered. For a time, million sword intents had little effect, and they barely stopped it for a while. After killing thousands of dead immortals, they couldn't stop it. With the weird sound resounding, dark red light beams rushed out from the bones of each dead immortal, forming a cobweb-like sky and earth net, and pressing against Jian Wushuang. The space seemed to freeze, he couldn't escape, and was immediately covered by the net that day. At the same time, the dead immortal army all gathered around, besieging Jian Wushuang in the center. Click. Accompanied by the stiff and twisting sound of the joints, the army of the dead immortals automatically gave way. Immediately afterwards, a huge fairy bone measuring tens of meters walked towards Jian Wushuang. His whole body was filled with boundless power, which was terrifying to the extreme. With eyes facing each other, the huge dead bones raised the broken true sword in his hand, and the tip of the sword pointed at him. I want to fight you. The hoarse and ethereal voice resounded from the mouth of the huge dead fairy. Jian Wushuang looked at him without saying a word, directly condensing an invisible sword. If you lose, your immortal source belongs to me, and the soul becomes a slave to this seat. The dead immortal bone said in a deep voice. Then he stretched out his palm, tore open the net of heaven and earth and walked in. Facing the death immortal who was as high as tens of meters, and was like a peak, Jian Wushuang did not care. Although dead immortal is weaker than Yanxian Du, the huge bones of dead immortal are not like ordinary Yanxian. Although he is also a skeletal bone, outside the skeletal bone, it is wrapped with hundreds of millions of threads of force, and it does not look much different from the ordinary fairy body. When a dark red light wheel appeared behind him, Jian Wushuang secretly said a bad sound. The light wheel condenses. It is the sixth revolution. Once it reaches the sixth rank, Dianxian will completely reach its peak. Although Jian Wushuang was able to fight Dian Immortal, he had no choice but to run away from rank 6 Dian Immortal. As the dead bones showed their strength, Jian Wushuang was inevitable, and the invisible sword in his hand pointed forward. Xiao Xiao Yanxian, you can't help yourself, Dead Immortal's skeleton said angrily. And then he started directly. The broken sword in his hand suddenly plunged into the bone road on the ground. Afterwards, the extremely violent sword intent tore through the road of the bones, like several dormant real dragons, all rushing towards Jian Wushuang. A section of Baigu Road was shattered, rolling up the dust. Seeing this situation, Jian Wushuang suddenly jumped into the air, holding up the invisible sword in his hand and crushing it down. Tendao surging up with sword intent enveloping thousands of immortal bones, rushing forward. When the two collided, the entire road of bones shook in an instant. Under the shock of this huge force, the huge dead fairy bone holding the real sword involuntarily retreated a few steps. An unmatched huamang shattered the sword intent carrying the fairy bones from beginning to end. Then Jian Wushuang floated to the ground. His robe was not stained with dust. The light ball in the eye socket of the dead immortal's bone flickered twice. Yu read the book www.akanshu. Calm, and then he held the true sword high and ran towards Jian Wushuang. Bai Bone Road trembled, and his heart moved slightly. In the previous match, he felt that although the dead fairy bones could still condense the light wheel, their strength had already declined to the extreme. The bones of the dead immortal now have only rank 3 strength at most. After feeling this change, Jian Wushuang decided to fight quickly. With a wave of his hand, the heaven gate of the ancestral technique power realm appeared. Then a giant finger from the sky directly covered the skeleton of the dead fairy. Seeing the huamang blooming above his head, the bones of the dead immortal raised their sword and stabbed them up. Rumble! The sky-reaching giant finger was directly smashed by the stabbing, and while dropping the endless tassels, it blocked all sight. "It's now!" Jian Wushuang screamed. His figure turned into a blue sword light, and he thrust forward. Chapter 49-49. This is actually happening too fast. When the huge dead fairy bones recovered, Jian Wushuang, who turned into a sword light, has quietly arrived in front of him. The eyes burst out with cold light. The invisible sword in Jian Wu's hands had already bloomed, and the tip of the sword then pierced forward. In the most central position is the source of the dead bones. As long as the invisible sword can penetrate, Jian Wushuang can release 1,000,000 sword intent in an instant, smashing it completely. But the next moment, the sudden change occurred. When the tip of the sword was only an inch away from the source of the dead fairy bone, 2 huge white bone fingers clamped his sword blade, and then smashed him out. Back hundreds of feet, Jian Wushuang was shocked. He had never expected that the dead fairy bones would react so quickly. Pushing him back, the bones of the dead immortal made a deep sound, and then again held the sword to cut forward. Facing the huge broken blade, Jian Wushuang also raised his sword to respond. Zheng! Zheng! Sword intent is vertical and horizontal, rushing for millions. The white bone road trembled, and once again stirred up a wave of dust. The sound of golden and iron strikes resounded through this entire road of bones, and the army of the dead immortals surrounding the sky and the earth all waved their true swords in their hands at this moment, and screamed loudly, "Kill, kill!" At this moment Jian Wushuang, who was fighting against the dead fairy bones, was more and more shocked. Facing the sword intent of a sword surpassing a sword, the bones of the dead immortal, which was as large as a god, not only did not feel heavier, but became lighter and lighter. She was able to calmly accept the sword intent cut by Jian Wushuang. This is not a reaction at all. Yanxian, who has not been exposed to kendo, can react. At this moment, Jian Wushuang had already had a doubt in his heart. Could it be that this 6th-ranked Dian immortal also practiced kendo during his lifetime? The battle was still going on, and if Wushuang kendo was not released, Jian Wushuang could not help him for a while. Just as Jian Wushuang was about to release Wushuang's swordsmanship, the dead fairy bones that had been silent suddenly spoke at this moment. "Are you a swordsman?" The hoarse voice was like a big palm, plucking the string in Jian Wushuang's heart. He moved intentionally and asked, "Are you also a swordsman?" There was no answer, but the cheeks of the dead fairy's bones followed with an expression of unknown meaning. Unexpectedly, in this dusty place, I would still meet a living swordsman. Before I was exiled, there were fewer than 10 Yanxian who could be called a swordsman in my long life. Now I have seen a real swordsman. Heaven treats me not badly. When he said this, Yijian forced Jian Wushuang back, and then stood still. I am also a swordsman, but that is a long time ago, and you can count as one who can make me call a swordsman. Jian Wushuang heard the words and didn't comment, but the invisible sword in his hand was still gaining momentum. Now, let's use the swordsman's way to solve it. Maybe the moment I can break through to the sword fairy will appear on you," said the dead bones. The broken real sword in his hand pressed down, and the blade pointed directly at Jian Wushuang. When Jian Wushuang heard his last words, the corners of his mouth curled up, and then said loudly, "You are still a long distance away from Jianxian like a moat. Then there are only 2 ways to go today. I will break through the sword fairy, or be killed by you." The dead fairy bones said in a deep voice. The real sword in his hand was severely cut at this moment. The bone road at the foot was also plowed into a deep gully under this blow. "Sword of the great Tianhe," he said in a deep anger. The broken blade exploded out of the most brilliant sword at this moment, and a mighty glowing shadow surged from his true sword. Space was oppressed, and the net of heaven and earth was shattered under this sword. Under this sword, Jian Wushuang felt the depression of the sacred mountain. This sword is enough to be a real swordsman. Jian Wushuang's eyes were solemn, and the invisible sword in his hand also blossomed. Wushuang Kendo Zinggehe Jianini, the second style. River. The towering Tianhe came from the sky, and the broken void came. The hundreds of millions of swordsmanship team is Tianhe, magnificent to the extreme. At this moment, the two heavenly rivers collided, blooming the most magnificent scene on the Bone Road. After seeing this scene, the army of dead immortals who had surrounded them all retreated wildly with tacit understanding. But it was too late. The two heavenly rivers collided, and the terrible situation that broke out swept everything. There was a dead fairy who ran slowly, and was involved in it on the spot, and turned into a fan. Under the shining of this sword light, the dead immortal bones subconsciously covered his eyes, and then his figure was swallowed by the sword light. At this moment, the infinite sword intent replaced Yanli, completely swallowing everything. This sword intent confrontation lasted for a long time, until nearly 10,000 feet of bones were turned into dust, and when all the dust settled, sword Tianhe ended. Dust will go to silence, everything will go to dust. Jian Wushuang's figure appeared on the broken bones road covered with fairy bone dust. Under the whiteness of the sky and the dust, he was the only one in his black clothes that was not contaminated with dust. And in front of him, 10 feet away, stood the bones of dead immortals dozens of feet high. The broken true sword in his hand was finally completely shattered, without even leaving the hilt, and his pupils were dim and dying. You broke my kendo. Yes, but I can only do this, Jian Wushuang said slowly, and some fluctuations flashed in his eyes. Is that the real kendo just now? The bones of the dead immortal stared at him, trying to find the answer. And Jian Wushuang didn't conceal it and said, that is my kendo, the kendo that I understand. I really didn't expect that I could fight against a real swordsman when I became this appearance. I am already satisfied, said the dead fairy skeleton. You are not a swordsman. Jian Wushuang heard the words, did not speak, whether he was a swordsman, did not need to be judged by others. After the dead fairy bone said the last sentence, he immediately said, you have exceeded the scope of a swordsman. You are a sword fairy. I have no regrets to be able to see Jiangxian's sword. Jian Wushuang raised his brows slightly. It was not like a strong person, the extremely proud rank 6 Dian immortal could say. Chapter 4950. As the Xianyuan shattered, the dead fairy bones knelt heavily on the broken bones road, and the huge bone palms waved in the air, seeming to want to keep the disappearing Xianyuan. Jian Wushuang, who stood in front of him, watched this scene calmly, and then dispersed the invisible sword in his hand. I'm going to die. The bones of the dead immortal whispered softly, but when the death light in his eyes was about to die, it suddenly brightened again, as if returning to the light. Although you are a sword immortal, there is a sword immortal on this road. I am looking forward to your battle, but I can't see it anymore. Their swordsmanship is even stronger than you. You won't be able to win so easily. After speaking these last words, the bones of the dead immortal fell completely, as if the peak of the gods were shattered. His bones were completely shattered into powder, and could no longer recover. Standing on this slowly healing white bone road, Jian Wushuang was silent. Although his face was calm, his heart was already shaking. In the road to the bones, there is actually a sword fairy. Such a news shocked Jian Wushuang far more than any news. In all fairness, a sword immortal is an unimaginable existence. But in Jian Wushuang's current knowledge, only Ding Bai can be called a true sword fairy. Even Jian Wushuang himself didn't agree that he was a sword immortal. He had an intuition that he could only fight Ding Bai completely after the Wushuang Kendo, and the last sword intent of Xinggehohai sword intent. Only then can he be called a sword fairy. But right now, the Dian immortal, who can be called the sword immortal by the bones of the dead immortal, is definitely a terrifying existence. Jian Wushuang's head is a little big when he thinks of this. What terrible existence is still trapped in this white bone road? Just as he was lost in thought, The dead immortals who had disappeared quietly recovered at this moment. A dark red death light burst from their eyes. Damn, haven't these things been dispelled? Jian Wushuang was startled secretly, and then ran without thinking. Although he is not afraid of the army of dead immortals, it is extremely wrong to make unnecessary consumption. As a result, in the next period of time, you can see that an arrogant figure is rushing across the road, and behind him are countless army of dead immortals. The White Bone Road is endless, and it has become more broad and mighty in the continuous advancement. It's like a Wangu battlefield that has experienced a miserable battle. There are broken bones everywhere. The most precious treasure without Lingyun, the broken true sword. It is extremely miserable. Jian Wushuang, who had been scouring at high speed, looked at the dead immortal army getting closer and closer behind him, and couldn't help but rise in anger in his heart. Just when he was about to destroy everything, the road to the bones underneath him trembled, as if something was waking up. "Excuse me to sleep. I see you little bugs, you really are too long." A lazy and faintly angry voice, as if resounding from the 9 heavens. Then the next moment, the clear sound of a long sword being unsheathed quietly sounded on the Wangu battlefield. With the clear sound of the long sword being unsheathed, the army of the dead immortals, who had been chasing Jian Wushuang frantically, all fled frantically. But it was too late. The sword curtain rose quietly, like a million meteors falling, causing the entire dark red void to tremble. Endless void, hundreds of thousands of miles of bones, all covered by the sword curtain. Every sword intent that formed the sword curtain was full of calm and endless meaning. Although it seemed peaceful, it made everything lose its color. Under the shroud of this shooting star sword curtain, none of the dead immortals survived. They died so simply that Jian Wushuang couldn't believe it. The infinite sword intent was finally desolate, and all the dead immortals standing in place were crushed. On the Wangu battlefield, dust is filled, but Jian Wushuang, who was in the center of the sword curtain, did not feel any fluctuations. This ability to control the sword intent was terrifying to the extreme. Jian Wushuang stood in place, ready to condense sword intent between his palms. But at the same time, an icy breath appeared behind him. "Hey Junior, don't try to draw the sword. Your speed will never be faster than mine. You can try if you don't believe me." A wisp of cold sweat flowed from Jian Wushuang's temples, and could come to his back silently, which already explained the problem. Immediately afterwards, the originally silent void suddenly surged with a layer of ripples, and then a figure walked out of the ripples. At this moment, Jian Wushuang's eyes opened to the fullest. The person who came was a woman of extreme heroism. The long and narrow willow eyebrows flew diagonally into the temples, a pair of eye-catching eyes to the extreme, and the embroidered red belt that held the long hair behind him also swayed with the wind. She wore a black and gold uniform with a pair of breasts, and 6 long swords slung across her waist. "This is a swordsman." She walked down from the void, and stood on the Fang Wangu battlefield, looking at Jian Wushuang with her extremely heroic eyes, revealing a somewhat intriguing look. Looking at the 6 long swords slung around her waist, Jian Wushuang couldn't help swallowing his throat. There is a tiger watching before, and a wolf watching behind. He caught in the middle is afraid that today is in danger. As time passed by, Jian Wushuang did not dare to move. After a long time, the heroic woman who straddled the 6 long swords suddenly said, "This junior is very good." Immediately afterwards, the mysterious figure behind him also spoke. "It is indeed very good. The concentration is extremely stable, and it is a great talent." When the heroic woman heard the words, she raised her eyes and said coldly, "Since you are a great talent, what are you doing squatting behind him? Are you planning to kill him?" As the words fell, the aura behind Jian Wushuang disappeared suddenly, and then a figure appeared in front of the heroic woman. "Well, I'm just used to it. I can't bear to kill such talented juniors. Keep them for great use." At this time Jian Wushuang saw that figure. He was also a very heroic middle-aged man, with a clean face and no need. But he looked like a bright star, but with a bit of laziness. On his waist there were 6 long swords, no more no less. Facing the heroic woman, the middle-aged man's face was full of unconcealable smiles. No, these two swordsmen are not sword lovers, right? Jian Wushuang felt a little big head, and it seemed that these two swordsmen might indeed be sword lovers. I'm afraid that next, he wants to escape from here. It will not be so easy. Chapter 4951. How strong is the kendo that can destroy the fairy source of the 6th-ranked Dian Immortal? And how strong is the guy who can use this kendo? In other words, it was this junior who caused the shock on the road to the bones. The middle-aged man asked slowly. The heroic woman nodded immediately. Yes, I just witnessed the battle. It was exciting enough. If it is him, it seems that it's time for me to wake up. The middle-aged man looked at Jian Wushuang. His mouth slowly conjured up a smile. Jian Wushuang unconsciously felt a cold behind him. He could feel these two sword companions. Although they did not show any strength, they were definitely more terrifying than rank 6 Dian Immortal. Thinking of this, he suddenly realized something. The bones of the dead immortal said before his death that there were sword immortals on the road of white bones. Are these two swordsmen the sword immortals? That big guy still had a barely enough strength before his death. Now his strength after death is no more than 3 ranks. It is not impossible to be beheaded by a powerful swordsman. It just makes me a little curious. The heroic woman paused at this point and looked at Jian Wushuang with interest. Junior, which sword is your own kendo? Jian Wushuang heard the words and nodded after a little thought. Yes. If you really created it yourself, the future achievements are immeasurable. The heroic woman said, and then stretched out her palm to flick in the air. In an instant, a picture scroll appeared in this chaotic void. Jian Wushuang saw this scene. His pupils suddenly shrank. In that picture scroll is actually the battle between him and the dead bones. In the picture scroll, the Tianhe River turns, and the bones of the dead immortal are finally penetrated by the Tianhe Xianyuan. All kinds of kneeling sitting on the bone road. Jian Wushuang never expected that the scene of the fight between them would be completely rubbed out. This heroic woman is definitely an extraordinary swordsman. When the picture scroll finally dissipated, the middle-aged man looked at Jian Wushuang, his eyes bright. Sure enough, it's really strong. I'm in love with this junior. Come on, junior, fight with me for 3 rounds. I haven't seen such a good piece in a long time. Jian Wushuang's eyes twitched slightly, looking at the extremely excited middle-aged man. Then he said, I'm afraid it won't work. I strayed into this place. I need to leave here as soon as possible. If I consume too much, I'm afraid I will become passive on the next journey. Up. Hearing this, the middle-aged man raised his eyebrows and said, It turns out that you are going on your way. That would be easier. If you walk 3 rounds under my hands, we will let you go all the way. If you avoid, I'm afraid it's hard to say if I fight. He said, patted the 6 long swords on his waist. Jian Wushuang felt that the battles were big, and he could feel that these 2 invisible sword companions were definitely more terrifying than they showed. It does not seem to be a simple matter to last 3 rounds. How are you thinking about it? The middle-aged man raised his eyebrows and said with a meaningful smile. After a short period of thought, Jian Wushuang replied, Come on, let's talk first. I only need to last 3 rounds and you will let me go. Happy, the middle-aged man laughed loudly and flew directly to Jian Wushuang. The hem of the black gold gown floated in the wind, and his right hand was pressed on the hilt of the 6-handed long sword at his waist, unspeakably wanton. And Jian Wushuang did not hesitate at all. An invisible sword condensed directly in his palm. Seeing this scene, the middle-aged man's eyes lit up again. Invisible and innocent, using kendo as a sword, juniors, you are bold. He immediately said, Don't dare to say the saber was destroyed, so I can only do this. The Tai Luo divine sword was destroyed by Ding Beichun, which was the fundamental reason why Jian Wushuang condensed the invisible sword. The middle-aged man smiled and stopped speaking, nodding slightly. My name is Yan Fan, and that woman is my wife, named Jiang Li. Jian Wushuang immediately arched his hands. Jian Wushuang. Sword warriors, good meaning, let's start. As the voice fell, the entire Wangu battlefield was silent. The middle-aged man named Yan Fan didn't seem to want to take the lead, but just looked at him with a smile. Jian Wushuang converged his mind and competed purely in kendo. He was not afraid. What he was thinking about was how to draw 3 styles in the next fight. At the next moment, Jian Wushuang moved, like a thunderous force, and his sword was swung to its extreme speed. The sharp and unmatched blade slashed straight towards Yan. This unremarkable sword, even Dianxian did not dare to underestimate it. But then a shocking scene appeared. Facing this sword, Yan Fan stood in place without evasiveness, then raised the middle of his right hand to clamp the invisible sword that was slashing down. The invisible sword that was transformed by Wushuang's sword's props was actually caught by at this moment. Jian Wushuang's pupil shrank, and he found that the invisible sword could hardly advance even more. The power is not small, but it is too impetuous, and it is easy to see the flaws. Yan Fan said with a smile, and then pushed it away. After stepping back several feet, Jian Wushuang was completely solemn, and Yan Fan, who did not show any signs of dew, was like the sacred peak of Yuan Juyu at this moment, making it impossible to guess what he was going to do next. Yan Fan still had a smile on his face, pressing his right hand on the hilt of his waist, and walking slowly to Jian Wushuang. Come again. Jian Wushuang converged his mind, and prepared to compete again. But this time, he just raised the invisible sword in his hand, and received a head-on blow. Yan Fan's right hand, which was holding the hilt around his waist, suddenly picked up, and a long sword was directly unsheathed. With the hilt as the head, carrying infinity, it instantly hit Jian Wushuang's chest. Boom! All this happened so quickly that when Jian Wushuang reacted, everything was over. He only felt that his chest was about to break. His figure retreated dozens of feet before he could digest the huge force. The unsheathed long sword returned to its sheath, as if nothing had happened. Yan Fan still looked at Jian Wushuang with a smile, always in an unhurried appearance. Rubbing his aching chest, Jian Wushuang gritted his teeth secretly. It was only these 2 fights that he fell into a passive state, almost suppressed by Yan Fan. While this made him depressed, he also had a certain understanding of Yan Fan. From the moment I practiced swordsmanship, I just took the action of unscathing, and I trained for a Chinese year. Chapter 4952. It's just an unimaginable thing to practice for a whole Chinese year, with just an unsheathing action. You must know that 1 Chinese year is equivalent to 10 times in the universe. After 10 times of cosmic reincarnation, only repeating something that even a 3-year-old child can do, such perseverance can no longer be described in any language. Even Jian Wu couldn't imagine how stubborn it would be to do so. He has only practiced for only a few tens of thousands of years, and he sincerely admires this old monster, who has been practicing for a long time. Faced with Yan Fan's invitation, Jian Wushuang could only smile and shook his head. Then he asked, "Are you a sword fairy?" Yan Fan raised his eyebrows and smiled. "Naturally, not only I am a sword fairy, but my wife is also a sword fairy. A pair of swordsmen, 2 swordsmen." Jian Wushuang smiled bitterly. When he learned that these 2 were real sword immortals, he knew why Yan Fan had made the 3 swords agreement before. This is the meaning of point to point. Once you step into the realm of sword fairy, you are basically at the absolute top. The heavenly immortal Ding Bai was the first sword immortal Jian Wushuang knew. The pair of swordsmen, Jiang Li and Yan Fan, were the other 2 sword immortals he met. Sword immortal and swordsman are fundamentally different, and Wushuang Kendo does not have a mellow Jian Wushuang, and it is not a sword immortal. Junior, come up with some real skills, let me take a good look at it, whether it's scary after all. Yan Fan patted the hilt and said loudly. And Jian Wushuang, at this moment, all condensed the overflowing aura. His whole body shape was like a real sword with hidden front waiting to be activated. Shuafeng lightly rises, causing a ripple in the void. In the next moment, he quietly opened his eyes and shot out 10,000 strands of cold light. No self is added. Wushuang Kendo, Zinggehohe Jianyini, the first style. Star. Without any fancy sword slash straight out, the entire void was shaken by it. Yan Fan, who was still smiling, reduced his smile at this moment, pressed the palm of the hilt, and quietly clenched it. The incomparably violent star-shaped sword intent shattered the void, and swallowed it forward with an endless momentum. and all voids along the way burst out of 10,000 feet of awning pillar. This style of sword intent is too magnificent and magnificent, as if the world has been swallowed. Facing this pose, Yin Fan quietly drew a snowflake-long sword from the 6 long swords on his waist. Then, holding a long sword in both hands, he cut a cross in front of his eyes. The void was chopped to pieces. The next moment, the violent star-shaped sword intent was cut open with a cross, turning into 4 rushing rivers and exploding in the void. And Yin Fan, who was in the most center, was unscathed, and the corners of his clothes were not broken. The violent sword intent wind blew the tips of his hair. Other than that, there was no fluctuation. When the sword intent completely dissipated, Jian Wushuang could not help but smile wryly when he saw Yin Fan without any damage. Couldn't even Wushuang Kendo have any influence on him? Holding a sword flower with the long sword in his hand, and then retightening the sheath, Yin Fan smiled and looked at Jian Wushuang. If I guess right, this sword is the beginning of the previous one. Jian Wushuang nodded, and being able to guess the connection between the sword intents was enough to see his horror. Yin Fan continued, very good, as the beginning of a kendo, it has such a powerful force. It is the only thing I have seen in my life. This first formula, if you have passed the level, there will be 2 following formulas. It depends on your good fortune. He said that the entire spilled breath was restrained at this moment. The snowflake longsword that had been sheathed by him was drawn out again, and the sharp point of the sword pointed towards Jian Wushuang. A great crisis surging from the bottom of his heart, he directly raised the invisible sword to deal with it, without even thinking about it. At this moment, the originally broken void quietly reflected infinite coldness. The sword curtain, like a ripple, covered the entire void. This is the real sword of Jian Xian. This sword directly killed the army of 100,000 dead immortals before. Countless true swords formed an endless sword curtain. If this formula is completely settled, Jian Wushuang will inevitably be hit hard. Facing this sword curtain, Jian Wushuang's divine mind was rapidly turning. When the sword curtain fell, the void couldn't bear the surge of sword intent, and became fragmented. The heroic woman who was watching this scene from afar, Jiang Li, had a solemn gaze, her palms pressed against the hilt of her waist, as if she was ready to help at any time. Although Jian Wushuang's stunning performance made her admire her, Jiang Li didn't think Jian Wushuang could resist this sword on his own. As a sword companion, she was extremely convinced that Yin Fan's sword was terrifying. Therefore, Jiang Li is ready to take in Jian Wushuang at any time. The emptiness is brilliant. The sword curtain falls suddenly, and the infinite sword intent is enough to easily defeat the heavens. Facing the infinite sword curtain rising from the sky, Jian Wushuang, who was in the most center, suddenly opened his eyes at this moment. A green sword intent different from the previous Wushuang swordsmanship rose from his feet. If the Wushuang Kendo represents magnificence and Lingran Wushuang, then this green sword intent is the meaning of vigor, rebirth and tenacity. Even Yin Fan, who saw this scene, was puzzled. He could feel that this sword intent was completely different from Jian Wushuang's previous sword intent. It was a brand new sword intent. Could it be that this junior has realized another kind of kendo? No one answered him. At this moment, Jian Wushuang's body was completely enveloped by the emerald sword intent. The blades of grass also rotate soft and tough. Even his pupils are full of green, flowing cloud grass sword style. 8th formula. Eyebrow cut in 4 seasons. Swordsmanship is at its ultimate level, and everything can be used as a sword. A lion grass and a willow branch are enough to release the sword. The infinite sword intent turns into green grass leaves, rising from the sky, as if spring flowers are approaching. The whole spectrum of Luyan grass sword style. The first 6 styles are simple, and the last 3 are complex. And Meijian 4 seasons is also the most terrifying style in the entire spectrum of Luyan grass sword style. You can see the main road in the end. The infinite green grass blades turned into a true sword, standing in the sword curtain under the pressure of the cover. The two collided and the most terrifying scene broke out. Chapter 4953. At this time, Yin Fan turned a deaf ear to Jiang Li's reproach, and stared solemnly at everything that happened in the sword curtain. For a long time, he said in a somewhat uncertain tone, "This junior seems to have broken my sword." Jiang Li, who was about to wave his hand to prevent the tragedy from happening, stopped in the air with his palms after hearing these words, turned his head and said, "What did you say?" "This junior seems to be breaking my sword." As if to prove his idea, the grass sword, which was originally fragmented and about to be unable to hold on, stopped being broken and began to gather quickly. In the next moment, the almost broken grass sword resurfaced, and the sword power became more powerful, with a tough and majestic momentum, and once again pierced the sky full of swords. Boom! Just as the heavens collapsed, the earth fell, and everything fell into destruction. This was the final collision of the two supreme sword intents, so that Yen Li was eclipsed at this moment. This slaying explosion, which was severe enough to destroy the bone road, lasted a long time. When the infinite sword curtain was all shattered, and the incomparable green sword intent disappeared, a black-robed figure walked out slowly on the broken bones. Jian Wu's double-faced color was still calm, but a bright red appeared at the corner of his mouth. Although he did everything that could happen, he was still traumatized, but fortunately he was right. Luyan grass sword style is far less sophisticated, magnificent, and wushuang than wushuang kendo, but at this moment, he succeeded in helping Jian Wushuang win this style. The corners of Jian Wushuang's mouth curled up slightly, and the trauma he suffered in this competition was almost negligible. And all this is because he used the flowing cloud grass sword style. If Jian Wushuang used Wushuang swordsmanship, he would certainly be able to take over Yen Fan's full-strength sword. But the price he would suffer would be heavy. Because this is a sword of Jinxian, the situation that received a heavy price was not something Jian Wushuang would like to see, because the following by Bone Road, once he was depleted, would almost be sentenced to death. Therefore, Jian Wushuang did not choose to fight hard, but used a flowing cloud grass sword to deal with it. From simple to complex flowing clouds and grass sword style, the meaning of kendo is tenacity and new life, which is enough for him to meet with minimal loss. Fortunately, it succeeded. Walking out of the center of the sacrificial explosion, unscathed, even Jian Wushuang, whose robes were not contaminated with half dust, came to Zhang Lian indifferently. A pair of swordsmen and two sword sages, at this moment, it is worthwhile to recover from the shock. The two of them looked at each other, and then all looked at Jian Wushuang. Being able to take a blow from the sword immortal with the strength of the swordsman, I am afraid that it will not be able to convince Yen Xian to reach any heaven. But this scene actually happened. Taking a deep breath, Yen returned. "Junior, your appearance is beyond our expectation. I am afraid that within a year, even if your kendo stops moving forward, it is enough to climb into the realm of Sword Fairy." Jian Wushuang arched his hands and said, "The predecessors are absurdly praised. Repairing the sword is at heart. Everything depends on your own good fortune. There is one last sword. If I win, can the two seniors let me go?" Jiang Li and Yen Fan looked at each other, and then a little bit dumbfounded. "Are we so scary, making you reluctant to stay longer?" It's still approachable." Jian Wushuang smiled bitterly. "But I really have something to do. I need to leave here as soon as possible. In that case, if I hinder it any more, it would seem a bit uncomfortable." Yen Fan smiled. "This last sword competition has no meaning anymore. You have already proved it to me." Jian Wushuang heard the words, secretly happy in his heart, and walked out of Jinxian almost unscathed. This is undoubtedly the best situation. The younger generation thank you here. Yen Fan nodded with a smile, then took a peek at Zhang Li next to him, and quickly came to Jian Wufang and hugged his shoulder. This move made Jian Wushuang a little confused. Looking at Yen Fan, who was full of ill intentions, he felt a bit cold on his back inexplicably. "Senior, you are." "Ahem, junior." "No, brother Jian, do you want to apprentice?" Yen Fan cleared his throat and looked at him with expectation and enthusiasm. Jian Wushuang heard the words, suddenly a little dumbfounded, and then said, "Senior, I already have a master. I'm afraid it won't work." Yen Fan didn't expect this to be the answer, so he was a little anxious. "Little brother, You must know that master can't recognize him randomly. The best match is to find the best match for him. When he said this, he patted his chest with his hand. Little brother, as long as you recognize me as a master, all the lifelong sentiments of my wife and I will be passed on to you. So you can consider it. The two sword immortals approached each other and offered such a tempting condition, which was enough to drive any swordsman in all the heavens into madness. But Jian Wushuang shook his head. Senior, I already have a master, so I really can't. Yan Fan was dumb. He never expected that he would not be able to be a master if he offered such a generous offer. At this moment, Jiang Li quietly appeared behind him and slapped him away. Old guy, how many Chinese years have passed and still so stubborn? Jiang Li yelled, then looked at Jian Wushuang and said, Little guy, you go, see you in the future. Jian Wushuang arched his hands. Thank you very much then. Just when he was about to turn around and leave, Yan Fan's voice rang again. Wait a minute. Jian Wushuang stopped, looking helplessly at Yan Fan who was catching up again. Before he could react, Yan Fan directly took his right hand and quickly tapped his on the wrist. Then, a real sword the size of an index finger was printed on his wrist. Jian Wushuang hurriedly retracted his wrist, trying to force this mark with Yan Li. You don't have to be in vain, little brother. This mark does no harm to you. It is my sword intent. You can detect where you are. If there is danger, your wife and I will go to rescue the first time. Before he could finish his words, he was slapped and flew out again. Jiang Li's face was full of anger, with one hand on his hips. It's really for the old and disrespectful guy. It's nothing but a sword fairy. Jian Wushuang smiled bitterly. He couldn't get rid of it, and it was an incredible thing that he could get two cheap masters for nothing. Chapter 4954. Jiang Li glanced at him, did not speak, and said quietly after watching Jian Wushuang's figure completely leave. I can't see through his future, but now I have one thing for sure. Jian Xian will not be his end, but the starting point. Yan Fan took a deep breath after hearing the words. It seems that our apprentice didn't get it in vain. What, your apprentice? Haven't you seen that he has already refused decisively? Jiang Li gave him another blank look and said angrily. He smirked and scratched his head. So what if you want to be a master? You have to be thick-skinned and stalking is very necessary. I have already left a mark on him. Can I escape us? The palms of the hands are not in place. Jiang Li looked at Yan Fan, and then at the endless sky. I am afraid that the limit of our life is here. Instead of continuing to sleep under this sea of blood, it is better to leave here and pass on all our swordsmanship. That little guy can take off the burden that master has entrusted to us. Yan Fan nodded and stretched. Indeed, after staying under this sea of blood for too long, the bones are about to rust. It's time to do business. Our swordsmanship is passed on to that kid. It will not be buried. Maybe it will reach another level. So this little guy can't let it go. After leaving the two sword immortals, Jian Wushuang let out a sigh of relief after traveling thousands of miles. The sense of oppression that sword immortal brought to him was really too great. If the two sword immortals were determined to let him leave, then he would never escape. Raising his right hand and looking at the sword-shaped mark on his wrist, Jian Wushuang shook his head helplessly. He restrained his mind and moved on. The road to the bones under the feet seems endless, although after many hardships, there is still no end in sight. This made Jian Wushuang a little depressed at first. If he continues to consume it like this, I am afraid that Di Qing hasn't found it yet, and he will sink into this endless sea. No matter what happens next, he will leave here as fast as possible, leave the so-called Tianlu, and find Di Qing. Jian Wushuang protects the body. Jian Wushuang swept forward, 1,000,000 miles in a flash. As he continued to move forward, he began to realize that the more the white bone rode, the less restless aura. All the fairy rhyme had disappeared, and even the fairy bone could not become a dead fairy, and the silence was extremely quiet. At the same time, instead of it, pure and strong generative power is flowing. This shocked Jian Wushuang. He had never imagined that under this river of blood, there would be such a strong generative power. At the same time, this made him wary. The subsequent changes in Baigulu also made him vigilant. The flat bones road originally paved by the bones of Yinxian began to appear arcs as they continued to move forward, which was an upward arc like a staircase. Jian Wushuang stopped and looked at the white bone road in front of the ladder. His eyes became serious. There is a hazy layer of faint power on the white bone road of this ladder, which stretches into the boundless void, and in the dark clouds at the end, there is a very vague outline. He muttered to himself again in his heart, and the scene now seemed a bit similar to the heavenly palace on the land and sky. If there were other branches of the white bone road, Jian Wushuang would definitely not be suspected of continuing to move forward. But now there is only one white bone road, and can only move on. Taking a deep breath, Jian Wushuang stepped on the ladder. The sole of the foot fell on the first step, and an invisible pressure cover immediately pressed against him. The pressure is intangible and qualitative, as if it is a certain rule directly suppressed. Jian Wushuang didn't hesitate too much. His footsteps swiftly, his figure moved forward quickly, but it turned out to be 10,000 steps. After 10,000 steps, Jian Wushuang stopped his figure, and there were already fine beads of sweat on his temples. The pressure on this ladder is far more terrifying than he imagined, and after a certain number of floors, the pressure will double. At 10,000 ranks, Jian Wushuang, who had already been forced, stopped, as if a million sacred mountain covers were pressing on him. Seeing the still endless road ahead, he gritted his teeth, and then moved forward again. This time his speed slowed down a lot. 10,000 orders, 30,000 orders, 50,000 orders, 70,000 orders. At this moment, Jian Wushuang was already in a difficult situation, and the power of his meridians had already reached its limit. A lot of sweat evaporates from every pore of his. 80,000 orders. The true shadow of selflessness was directly forced out. With the blessing of the true shadow of Wu-self, Jian Wushuang only felt relaxed all over his body, and he could walk forward quickly. When he reached the 90,000 level, the huge palace that was originally wrapped in black clouds finally appeared. It was a magnificent palace built in the sky, full of endless stern and cold atmosphere. Jian Wushuang has an inexplicable intuition that this heavenly palace is most likely an imperial palace left over from the ancient times. Heaven? Could it be that this is another Tianting site of the past? When he thought of this, Jian Wushuang thought of the former heavenly court of Emperor Lu Kuo. In the past, the imperial court meant that opportunities and great crises coexisted. But he didn't have any interest in developing this heavenly court. He had to know that even if the emperor was angry, he could not bear the pressure. But now Jian Wushuang has no way to escape. He can only bite the bullet and head to the former heavenly court. The last 10,000 steps are almost a blend of the first 90,000 steps, and all the pressure is unprecedented. Jian Wushuang almost couldn't hold it even with the addition of Wu Mei Jinying. He didn't even dare to breathe at will, for fear of being crushed by the terrible pressure of his body. 95,000 steps. 96,000 steps. 98,000 steps. At this point, the three avenues of Jian Wushuang were oppressed. Wushuang Kendo, way of protection, the way of killing. The addition of 3 avenues allows him to move forward. 99,900 steps. When he reached the last step, he was already at the end. Every pore is no longer sweat at this moment, is the red blood of God. Divine blood dripped down his robe in front of the heavenly court, and was quickly absorbed. Jian Wushuang, trembling his hands, took out a D-pin pill, and stuffed it into his mouth before stopping his injuries. Some broken immortal bodies recovered quickly. Slowly exhaling a turbid breath, Jian Wushuang felt comfortable all over, and the previous fatigue disappeared in a flash. Chapter 4955. With the sound of this endless majesty resounding, 2 Dayan immortals holding the halberd tore the void and walked out. 2 3-turn Dayan immortals. Jian Wushuang was alert for an instant, and an invisible sword appeared in his palm. Those who wield the sword into the heavenly court die. The 2 Dayan immortals holding the halberd burst out loud, and the cold light burst into their eyes. In the face of the 2 Tier 3 Dayan immortals, Jian Wushuang was actually still elusive, but at this time he was unavoidable. There was only one battle. The two halberds crossed, and an unparalleled giant light burst out instantly. These two heavenly court gatekeepers didn't even ask the reason, and directly attacked them. Jian Wushuang had to deal with it. With a slash of the sword's edge, 36,000 sword intents rose, all strangling forward. Jian Wushuang, who has realized his strongest sword intent, has now reached another unprecedented realm in his control of kendo and sword intent. Not only kendo, but also enveloping ancestors and immortal styles are one step closer. If it weren't for the fact that there was no source of immortality, Jian Wushuang was confident that he would be able to climb into the realm of Dian Immortal as early as after the battle with Jiutian Xianjunchang dueling. But there is nothing if. Now he is still just the peak of the immortal. However, he is an immortal, but he has the terrifying strength to be able to kill the immortal. Facing the violent cold light, 36,000 sword intent strangling away from all directions. Boom! In front of the heavenly court, the most magnificent martyrdom broke out. The two heavenly gatekeepers stepped back together. Their eyes became cautious and solemn. Jian Wushuang picked up his long sword and stood still in place, and did not pursue the victory. I have no intention of entering the heavenly court, but this is the only way for me to go out. If you can tell other ways to leave, I will definitely leave. Hearing what he said, the two gatekeepers looked at each other, and there was less murderous in their eyes. In the end, an older Dian immortal stepped forward and said in a deep voice, "You go back, and you will disturb the emperor's sleep. Once the emperor wakes up, no one can save you. I don't intend to harass, but this is probably my only way. Only from here can I leave, so I can't retire." Jian Wushuang didn't retreat in the slightest, and said in a solid voice, "Bold, you are a little Yenxian who dare to be so arrogant? Are you not afraid that this seat will kill you on the spot?" The gatekeeper took a step closer again, holding the palm of the halberd, as if he was about to kill in the next moment. He still stood there and said quietly, "You can't kill me." Extremely arrogant. The gatekeeper smirked, and the heavenly halberd in his hand was about to smash at Jian Wushuang. However, at this moment the sudden change occurred. The sky halberd that was raised high lay across Jian Wushuang's head. No matter how hard it was as if some form of invisible heaven had restrained it. Even if his face flushed, he couldn't go any further. Jian Wushuang was also a little strange. He didn't release any power and sword intent to stop him. But the gatekeeper's appearance did not appear to be fake, but was truly restrained. In the next moment, the giant gate of heaven that seemed to have been silent for countless years slowly opened, reflecting the endless glory. The expressions of the two gatekeepers changed drastically, and they didn't even think about it. They knelt in front of the heavenly court, not even daring to lift their heads. The brilliance dissipated in an instant, and everything returned to calm. "Come in." A low voice, and with the ethereal voice above the heaven, resounded from the heaven. Jian Wushuang's heart trembled unconsciously. A living emperor? He couldn't believe it. Could it be that an emperor was really sealed off in this endless sea? Suppressing the uncomfortable spirit, Jian Wushuang finally decided to step into the heavenly court. He already had a determined mentality. If the emperor didn't plan to let him go, the big deal would be death. At least he could be reborn in the future. Stepping into the heavenly court, the Wenyu ground beneath her feet quietly lit up, and then illuminated the entire heavenly court. The heaven was vast and empty. There were no mountains and sea pillars listed. There were no case slips seated one by one, and some were just empty. Jian Wushuang was in this heavenly court, inexplicably feeling a chill in his heart. "You came." That endless, majestic and ethereal voice resounded in this heavenly court, and he couldn't even notice where the voice came from for a while. "You are the first visitor I have seen since I fell asleep, and as early as a few years ago, I had counted such a day." As this voice fell, an emperor-robed figure slowly walked out from the depths of the heavenly court. The unspeakable aura of heaven circulates around him, making people just look at it, and never dare to look directly. After Jian Wushuang saw this scene, his pupils suddenly shrank, as if he had seen something unbelievable. The figure of the emperor, wearing the emperor's clothes, is exactly the same as Zhen Weiyang's. Whether it's the face, body shape, or the breath flowing through the body, they are exactly the same as Zhen Wuyang born, just like carved out of a mold. Do you think I am familiar with it? Exactly like the emperor in your heart? The emperor came slowly to Jian Wushuang, his face calmly said. Jian Wushuang's heart was shocked and he said solemnly, "Do you know what I'm thinking? Of course, everything I want to know is impossible to hide." He continued, his true eyes, as if he could see Jian Wushuang thoroughly. And Jian Wushuang couldn't help but panic secretly. If it was exactly what he said, it would be too terrifying. The emperor continued, "I had foreseen this scene a few years ago, but what I didn't expect was that the person who came would be a trivial immortal. Have you been to Heavenly Court?" Facing the question, Jian Wushuang pondered for a moment, and finally nodded. "I have been." "Have you seen Zhen Wuyang?" "I have seen it. Do you think I am a little similar to him?" Jian Wushuang nodded again, and muttered to himself, "More than a little similar, is exactly the same. I also know myself, exactly the same as Zhen Wuyang. Do you want to know why?" The emperor smiled slightly. Although his face was no longer young, he could still see the endless heroism. He seemed to be in a memory, and Jinwu looked over Jian Wushuang and looked into the distance. "His name is Zhen Wuyang, and my name is Zhen Wu. However, 10,000 realms Tianyu only knows Emperor Zhen Wuyang, but not Emperor Zhen Wu. In other words, I am him, and he is also me." Chapter 4956. Emperor Zhenwu looked at him. "Zhen Wuyang is one side, and I am his other side." Jian Wushuang didn't know how to describe this relationship anymore. As the supreme emperor Zhen Wuyang in the entire vast Desai realm, would he be sealed in the Sea of No Edge? This is really weird. And why did Zhen Wuyang seal him in the borderless sea? As if seeing what Jian Wushuang was thinking again, Emperor Zhenwu said in a slow voice, "The only reason he wanted me to be here was that he could not control or destroy me. He could only keep me forever. The endless town is here. I am the other side of him, with a strength that is deeper than him. Facing another him that cannot be controlled or destroyed, he made this move. I, sleeping here, want to leave all the time. As early as the eve of my imminent closure, I pushed to show you your appearance, so you should know how to do it." Hearing this, Jian Wushuang stepped back without a trace. His eyes flashed with vigilance. "Take me out of here in exchange for the same. I let you leave here, how about?" Emperor Zhenwu approached him slowly. Jian Wushuang's mind turned quickly, and he quickly said, "I'm afraid it won't work. I can't protect myself now. It's not realistic to want to leave here completely." The Emperor Zhenwu seemed to be able to penetrate his heart easily, and then said with a smile, but a smile, "You were not exiled by Zhen Wuyang, but you came involuntarily. An immortal who came involuntarily, and can live safely, until now there will definitely be a way to get out." Jian Wushuang was a bit big-head for a while. "I'm afraid it's only up to God's will to get out then." Emperor Zhenwu smiled slightly when he heard the words, then stretched out his hand to Jian Wushuang's arms. "You have the breath of Emperor Wuyang." He was taken aback, stretched out his hand and touched it in his arms, then took out a golden and jade ring. "Why do you have Zhen Wuyang's ring? He gave it to you." Zhenwu Emperor said in a cold voice. Jian Wushuang said, He didn't give it to me, but someone else gave it to me." Emperor Zhenwu didn't go further, but his eyes were a bit solemn. "Open the ring." Jian Wushuang had no choice but to follow suit. When the ring was opened, nothing happened. He breathed a sigh of relief without a trace, and then said, "I will sleep in this ring later, and when you get out of the endless sea, you can release me from it, and then your task will be completed." Jian Wushuang heard this. Although he was a little helpless, but he could only do it. After all, if he didn't agree, the result could be imagined. The only blame is that he is too weak. Facing the level of the emperor, he can't even escape. After speaking these last words, the real body of Emperor Zhenwu directly turned into a cloud of smoke and entered the ring in Jian Wu's hands. Seeing a strange color from the ring in his hand, Jian Wushuang did not relax, but his mood became heavier. In his opinion, this Zhenwu emperor was not as harmless as he showed, but what he didn't say was the point. If the explanation takes him out of the borderless sea, I am afraid the entire DCU will fall into an unpredictable situation. Thinking of this, Jian Wushuang hurriedly stopped the thoughts he was thinking about, because he suddenly thought that this Jinwu emperor could guess what he was thinking. At this moment, Emperor Zenwi's faint voice rang from the ring again. By the way, after you leave here, remember not to return to Tianlu. Leave here directly, and don't be discovered by them. After speaking these last words, Emperor Zenwi's voice completely disappeared. And as the emperor's breath converged, the entire heavenly court supported by the emperor's breath began to enter an irreversible collapse. Emperor, the gate of the heavenly court opened, and the two gatekeepers Dianxian rushed into the heavenly court in a panic. Their emperor has long since disappeared. How can they be found again? Jian Wushuang stood on the spot, watching the two immortal bodies of Dian Immortal guarding the gate continue to shatter, and finally died in the endless dust with the entire heavenly court. With the death of this heavenly court, the White Bone Road has long since disappeared, and even the blood river hanging above the head fluctuates violently at this moment. Jian Wushuang's figure stood in the void, his eyes looking forward. In front of the broken heavenly court site, a giant gate that seemed to have been sealed in dust for countless years appeared at this moment. Without any hesitation, Jian Wushuang went straight ahead. He had been under this river of blood and bones for a while, and could not stay any longer. A majestic force swept from his palm, and slammed on the giant gate. Boom! The entire domain of the Wanxian Bone and Blood River was in chaos at this moment. The giant gate slowly opened, and countless sacred flowers shone out from behind the giant gate. Without any hesitation, Jian Wushuang directly pushed himself into the giant gate. As the blooms dissipated, the hazy and misty breath under the river of blood disappeared, and replaced by the barren breath in the endless sea. Out! Looking at the gray-white land all over, Jian Wushuang let out a sigh of relief. At this moment, he should still be in the sky and land, but he has completely far away from the most central temple. Recalling Emperor Zenwi's last request in his mind, he thought about it for a while before he decided to leave Tianyu directly. But what Jian Wushuang didn't expect was that when he stepped out of his front foot, dozens of cracking sounds sounded behind his back foot. The next moment, above the otherwise silent heaven and land, dozens of black-robe envoys completely enclosed it from all directions. Roughly speaking, there are no fewer than 50 black-robe envoys, and each of these black-robe envoys is at the lowest level of rank 3. This undoubtedly gave Jian Wushuang a great pressure. The two sides were in a state of confrontation. In the end, a black-robe envoy slowly stepped forward and arched his hands. His Royal Highness, please move to the Tiangong. What if I say no? He raised his brows slightly and said coldly. Hypo was startled. Obviously he didn't realize that Jian Wushuang would say that. If that's the case, don't blame us for being impolite. Hype, she said coldly. In an instant, none of the 50 or so black-robe envoys had any reservations. One by one, the powers are intertwined to construct, forming a net of heaven and earth to enclose the sword without double layers. Seeing the dense nets spread over his body, Jian Wushuang's heart surged with anger. He did not have any intersection with the emperor in this heaven and land, but he was involved in this mixed water for no reason, especially when he was dragged into the river of blood in his life of 9 deaths. Chapter 4957. With more than 50 members of the 3 ranks Dian Immortal's might, the heaven and earth nets unleashed are unprecedentedly strong. At this moment, the heaven and land plains beneath him began to tremble unbearably, seeming to be broken at any time. Jian Wushuang was in this net of heaven and earth, and there was no possibility of escape at all. And he didn't have the idea of escaping. A bloodthirsty crimson was revealed in the deep pupils. But the nets of heaven and earth, thick as chains, entangled him in an instant, and the terrible general situation was spreading. The thunder snake, thick as an arm, surged, quickly consuming the strength of Jian Wushuang's fairy body. The head black-robe envoy saw that he had been trapped and hurriedly shouted, "Take it away!" In an instant, more than 50 black robes set off, each with a chain of Yanli in their hands, ready to rush forward. But an unexpected scene appeared. Collecting the power of 50 Dian immortals, they failed to drag Jian Wushuang once. He stood in place, like a horrible mountain covering the sky and the sky, and even if dozens of Yanli chains left deep marks on his fairy body, he could not drag it. The black robes who saw this scene were shocked. You must know that this is the power of more than 50 Dian immortals. Can't even control a little Yanxian. Give me up. The black robe made an angry voice. The Yanli chain in his hand was almost tightened into a straight line. The other black robe envoys followed suit and tightened Yanli's chains. If this weird scene is seen by outsiders, it will definitely be horrified. The situation where there was no suspense at all has actually fallen into a struggle. Jian Wushuang couldn't move every inch, even if the Yanli chain on the fairy body had stretched to the extreme. Strands of scarlet light came out from his body, and the way of killing was already added. At this moment, Jiutian Yixian also showed an azure glow, sheltering his fairy body from any damage. The true shadow of Wumei, the way of killing, was added. Jian Wushuang was completely furious at this moment. He suddenly raised his arms, facing the Yanli chain around him, and slammed it down. Boom! The extremely dull voice resounded, and nearly 20 Yanli chains shattered directly under this blow. On the spot, there were more than 20 black robes that quickly retreated 100 feet. Jian Wushuang's whole body lightened. He continued to stretch his arms like this, and once again smashed all the remaining Yanli chains around the fairy body. All the black robe envoys retreated 100 feet, and then met again. Jian Wushuang was soaked in blood with the double-eyed sword Wushuang, and directly confronted him. While taking into account his strength, his figure was like a ghost, so that all black robe envoys could not figure it out. The digital black robe envoy who rushed forward only felt that a blood shadow flashed in front of them, and then all spit out a thick sacred blood without warning. Their chests all collapsed at this moment, almost broken. Jian Wushuang blasted dozens of punches at an unimaginable speed. The black robe envoys who rushed forward received at least 2 punches each, and the immortal body was almost shattered. Repelling the digital black robe envoys in an instant, Jian Wushuang suddenly condensed the invisible sword, and then slashed down heavily. Wushuang Kendo, Xinggehejianini, the first style. Star. Zhang. The incomparable crisp sound of the sword burst out at this moment. The entire sky of 100,000 li was trembling under this sword. A sword slashed straight out, dimming the general momentum that Dian Immortal exudes. Boom! A million sword intent completely exploded, tearing a large area of the sky directly along the way, and then exploding in the middle of the black robe by thousands of awning pillars. The reason that Jian Wushuang, who has the true shadow of selflessness, the way of killing and the body, rarely uses kendo, is that the uncontrollable factors are too heavy. The appearance of this galaxy, lake and sea sword intent almost instantly consumed more than half of the power to support the fairy body. At the same time, the immortal body is better than immortality. Cracks appeared at this moment. The right arm of Jian Wushuang holding the sword had already begun to crack, and his blood was dripping with blood. The true shadow of selflessness and the way of killing are so exhausting that after Jian Wushuang released his first sword intent, he had to use the power of Emperor Pin Pill. He quickly stuffed several pills into his mouth, and quickly recovered. Under this sword, the encircling circle was slashed abruptly to make a gap, and several black robes made it impossible to dodge, was destroyed Xian Yuan, and died tragically. The power of a sword so terrible. But this sword did not destroy the beliefs of these black robe envoys. They just rushed over again after a while. All kinds of magnificent and resplendent fairy styles, as well as the most treasures, slammed Jian Wushuang's head into his pocket at this moment. For a time, the world is prosperous. Even if Jian Wushuang could be 10, he could only choose to fight hard when facing these various immortal styles and treasures. The martyrdom of different sizes exploded completely at this moment. The full blow of more than 40 Dian immortals was so terrible that at the same time that Jian Wushuang's figure dissipated, even the Tianlu plate was crushed for 1,000,000 miles. What is certain is that if they let go of their hands and feet, the heaven and land plane composed of Yanxian bones will all be overthrown. Seeing the center of the big explosion where 1,000,000 miles of the sky turned into dust and ashes, All the black robe envoys were unconsciously relieved. This guy is just Yin Xian. The oppression brought to them is really terrible. With a wave of hands, he can severely injure, or even kill a rank 3 great Yin Xian. What kind of terrifying strength is this? Fortunately, he has fallen right now. All the black robe envoys are extremely convinced that no immortal can survive this blow. With the fall of the sky, the leading black robe envoy did not relax, his eyes still solemn. He has an unimaginable hunch that Jian Wushuang will not die. As if to confirm his thoughts, when the unparalleled blast dissipated, and all the black robe envoys had recovered their treasures, a figure still standing in the void appeared. At this moment, all the black robe envoys took a step back unconsciously horrified. Ahem! A large mouthful of divine blood spurted from his mouth, and then spilled into the sky. At this moment, his aura was utterly weak, and there was no real shadow of self, and the way of killing was all broken. Even as Jian Wushuang's most powerful trump card, he couldn't support it in the end, and the bombardment was shattered by more than 40 black robes. Chapter 4958. Fortunately, there were still a few D-pin pills hidden in his mouth, and he directly chewed and swallowed. But in this stage of the immortal body, being on the verge of destruction, Jian Wushuang no longer has the power to fight. The black robe envoys, who had been horrified at first, breathed a sigh of relief again, after vaguely realizing that he was incapable of a fight. The head of the black robe made Tiking's face finally eased, but he still did not dare to relax, and directly released a chain of Yanli, which bound Jian Wushuang. The rest of the black robe envoys also released their own chain of strength, directly enveloping his entire body, before giving up. From this we can also see how far they are afraid of Jian Wushuang. Jian Wushuang, whose whole body was with only one head exposed, panted slightly, letting himself be dragged forward. He closed his eyes tightly, obviously repairing the broken fairy body quickly. In this battle, more than 10 black robe envoys were lost before they were reluctantly taken down, and the black robe envoy who was walking in the forefront looked pale. If it wasn't for Jian Wushuang to return to the Emperor City Temple, he could not wait to crush Jian Wushuang into powder on the spot. At the same time, he was horrified in his heart. What is the origin of this little Zhao Yangxian? He was able to cross border to kill Dianxian. And not only that, he even walked out of the river of blood and blood. This is the point that made him feel deeply afraid. Under the river of blood, even if it is the flow of Dian Immortal, you will be directly lost in your mind, and you will not be able to get out of it. As the protagonist of the Emperor's Son, no immortal Yin knew better than him what terrible existence was under that river of blood. Just the endless army of dead immortals is enough to swallow any Dian Immortal, let alone those mysterious ancient powers that cannot be looked at directly. You must know that even the Emperor's heavenly official, Bian Ziyuan, dare not get involved easily. But Jian Wushuang came out alive, with all his tales coming out, condensing the deepest meaning in the heart. More than 40 black robe envoys tied Jian Wushuang, and rushed to the center of the entire Tianlu, the palace of the Emperor City. When the imperial city covered by clouds appeared in front of him, all the black robes breathed a sigh of relief again. Their mission is completed. The Tianmen of the Emperor City slowly opened, and then they quickly entered, as if nothing had happened. In the distant land where no one noticed, an old man watched this scene in horror. He had an inexplicable intuition. It seems that the sky is about to change. Entering the imperial city, stepping on the road of white bones, a line of black robes galloped forward quickly. The giant gate of the Temple of Heaven had already opened, and Bian Ziyuan stood in front of the Temple of Heaven with his arms folded, as if he had been waiting for a long time. De Tianguan another 12 were lost. The leader of the black robe envoy stepped forward and whispered. Bianzi nodded far away. My way, you are doing very well, let's go on. The black robe messenger promised, and then directly left Jian Wushuang, which was tied into a zongzi, in front of him. Bianzi Yuan immediately showed a meaningful smile. You did a great job too. Congratulations, you survived. Jian Wushuang looked at him coldly, and said nothing. Don't try to resist. You are just the end of the crossbow. This seat can easily kill you. After speaking these last words, Bian Ziyuan stretched out his hand and carried him into the temple of heaven. The cold, withered hall was still the same as the first time we met, except that the damaged mountain and sea pillar had been repaired. The gloomy young man walked out from the depths of the hall slowly and came to Jian Wushuang with great interest. "I'm very curious. How did you get out of there alive? Tell me what you saw under that river of blood, and what you got." Looking at the young man in front of him and the crowds of black-robe envoys, Jian Wu was pale and weak, and said weakly, "First, untie me. I'm out of strength." The young man heard the words, meditated for a moment, then looked at Bian Ziyuan and said, "Untie. His Royal Highness." Bian Ziyuan was a little reluctant, but seeing his persistence, he had to reach out and untie it. The chains fell off layer by layer, and Jian Wushuang escaped. "Can you tell me?" The young man took a step forward, seemingly very eager. At this moment, the joints of the whole body made a slight noise, as if waking up from a deep sleep. Standing next to Bian Ziyuan, he was shocked when he saw this scene. He realized something, and hurriedly released exquisite mist. But everything is too late. Jian Wushuang, who was out of trouble, swept away his previous weakness, and his whole body surged into an unimaginable general trend. His right hand directly condensed an invisible sword, piercing the young man in front of him at a speed so fast that all the black-robe envoys could not react. Since this distance was too close, he could only watch a long sword with a million sword intent pierced into his body. Time seemed to stagnate, and a small, light sound resounded at this moment. Then, 36,000 sword intent also poured into his body, directly causing unimaginable injuries. The sword intent shredded the fairy body and broke out completely. Then, the exquisite mist released by Bian Ziyuan hit Jian Wushuang. But it was too late. He had successfully escaped and retreated 100 feet in an instant. "You wanna die?" Bian Ziyuan was so angry that he couldn't add to it. He didn't expect Jian Wushuang to be so arrogant that he would kill the emperor in front of him. But Jian Wushuang, who stood holding the sword, smiled wantonly, and didn't even look at all the black-robe envoys in this temple, even with Bian Zi. After looking back at Bian Ziyuan for the last time, Jian Wushuang flew away directly. "Kill me on the spot. Whoever kills this son, set up a small official." Bian Ziyuan was already furious to the point that it could not be added. All the black-robe envoys in the entire temple rushed out upon hearing this. Just the seat of Xiaoxiangguan is enough to drive them crazy. The position of heaven official attached to the emperor's breath means that he can enjoy the moistness of the emperor's luck. This is unimaginable luck, enough to make them all crazy. At this time, the immortal body was completely broken, but the young man who did not know what kind of magical power condensed everything with a pale face and hoarsely said, "Don't kill him, save him. Whether we can leave here or not depends on him." Bian Ziyuan looked uncertain, and finally said cruelly, "Even if he is let go, I will make him pay a little price." Boom! The giant gate of the heavenly hall was opened by Jian Wushuang with a single sword. He stepped on Yunyan, and another sword cut the road of bones by 1,000 feet. Then he stood proudly above the void, like a real sword fairy, unrestrained to the extreme. He didn't seem to realize that he was running away, but he was traveling through the heavens and lands. Jian Wushuang wanted to fight, not escape. Chapter 49-59. Hundreds of streamer-like figures flew out from the temple, and they continued to flow. Hundreds of figures are hundreds of Dian immortals. They are Dian immortals who are beyond the immortal. Their appearance filled the entire void with supreme aura. And Jian Wushuang is not unable to escape, but unable to escape. He knew that he couldn't escape from the hands of so many Dian immortals, so he simply stood still and prepared for a desperate battle. Being in this boundless sea, Jian Wushuang was isolated and helpless, and could only rely on himself. Although there are 3 true souls of emperors in the Boyang bottle, this time, he does not intend to use them. If they know that their true souls are dissipated, it means that they will never be able to resurrect. So Jian Wushuang could only rely on himself. He even imagined where he would recover again after his fall. Looking at the black robe ambassadors who surrounded themselves in front of them, there were no fewer than 100. You must know that these are all Dayan immortals, and none of them are below the 3rd rank. Although they have been weakened to a certain extent in this borderless sea, Dayan immortal is still Dayan immortal, and their strength is still extremely terrifying. In the void, Jian Wushuang stood in the middle of the void, with broken bones under his feet. A steady stream of black robe ambassadors walked out of the temple and came to him. Slowly exhaling a murky breath, Jian Wushuang raised the real sword in his hand and pointed it straight ahead proudly. The black robe envoy pointed to by his swordsman stepped back subconsciously, as if no one wanted to do it first. Jian Wushuang smiled disdainfully. Facing so many Dayan immortals, he actually took the lead. The true shadow of selflessness, the way of killing, the way of guarding, the way of unparalleled swordsmanship, all 3 ways. This is the first time that Jian Wushuang has made all 3. The way of guarding was the first avenue on which he became an ancestor, and it was the most powerful avenue, the avenue that envelopes the entire universe of divine power. His long hair broke open, dancing wildly in the void, and the true blue selflessness surged behind him. Thousands of scarlet-red lights that represent the way of killing are flowing slowly. The invisible rules of heaven, representing the way of protection, protect his fairy body, and the dense lines slowly rotate. The Xuanhe red gold pattern representing Wushuang Kendo flows from the tips of his hair. 3 ways to add oneself. The reflection of him at this moment cannot be directly looked at. The black robe shattered, revealing the immortal body. The fire phoenix totem, which belongs to the ancestor of the Feng clan, uttered in his chest. At this moment, all the black robe envoys retreated, and their expressions were all shocked to the extreme. Is this the power that Yinxian can show? This turned out to be the power that Yinxian could show? This is actually the power that Yinxian can show. The repeated questions in my mind caused all the black robes to retreat without stopping, and even the breathing was a little short. The mighty power emanating from an immortal, they all couldn't raise their heads when they were oppressed, which was too terrifying. The 3 avenues were added, and unimaginable luck was flowing. At this moment, Jian Wushuang is the real existence that oppresses the heavens. He became completely devoid of emotion, just raised his hand at random, and suddenly a Tianhe roared and swallowed the void. A 7-star system is completely blooming between his eyebrows. All the divine thoughts are his domain, and in his domain, he is the real emperor. Use the fairy style against the fairy style. At this moment, Jian Wushuang's control of the immortal style had completely reached another unimaginable point. Just under this finger, more than a dozen black robes fell on the spot, forcibly tore a crack in the encircling circle. All the black robes were shocked, and they could feel the terrible flow of luck from this finger. For a moment, all the black robe envoys were extremely sure, Jian Wushuang, it was impossible for him to be an immortal. His existence seemed to have surpassed Dayan immortal, and reached a certain unknown realm. There was no other reason. It was that Jian Wushuang's surging aura was so strong that it even affected their judgment. With 3 additions, Jian Wushuang now seems to be evasive, crushing against them with an unknown general trend. The invisible sword in his hand has been shining to the extreme. Behind him was a huge invisible sword in his hands, which was more than 1,000,000 feet tall. It's a big deal. At this moment Wushuang Kendo opens. Wushuang Kendo, Zinggehejianini the 2nd style. River. The towering Tianhe descended from the sky, and the void was shattered by the impact. The Tianhe composed of billions of sword intents flowed through Jian Wushuang's body, and then roared forward. This is Wushuang Kendo, the most peak release. Tianhe sword intent. Far better than the previous 100 times damage. The true shadow of selflessness, which is more than 1,000,000 feet tall, also released the sword intent of the galaxy and lake at this moment. The sky collapsed, and the road to the bones was directly shattered. At this moment, all the hard-headed black robe envoys dared not stay. All of them retreated quickly in horror. But this majestic and brilliant sword intent was so fast that it directly swallowed dozens of black robe envoys while smashing the road to the bones. At this moment, the 3rd-ranked Dayan immortal was beheaded without any resistance. Huang swordsmanship Tianhe swallowed everything. Hundreds of millions of swordsmanship, extremely bright. It impacts everything that can be destroyed. The entire imperial city began to vibrate violently, and then ravines cracked from the wall. When the kendo Tianhe dangled above the temple, all the black robe envoys who had escaped looked extremely miserable. They knew that the temple of heaven would never be able to withstand this blow. One thought is broken, only in the evening. When this unparalleled river of swordsmanship was about to overwhelm the temple, a figure quietly walked out of the temple, and then rushed up. Thousands of hazy water mists escaped from that figure at this moment, and enveloped the kendo Tianhe. This is a strong blow, an unstoppable blow. But Bian Ziyuan has been unavoidable. His raised arms showed a weird bending posture that was oppressed at this moment. The robes around him were directly crushed to pieces, revealing the chest with flowing clouds and water patterns. Ah! Bian Ziyuan's forehead blew veins violently. He never thought that this sword would be so terrifying. Even he could not stop it. Damn fellow, this seat will definitely crush your head with your own hands. Chapter 4960. Bian Ziyuan didn't dare to be big anymore. Jian Wushuang in front of him was already different from when he first met. At this moment, the strong unknown luck on his body almost broke the heaven and the land plane, which was extremely terrifying. The speed of the flowing clouds and water patterns accelerated, and at the same time the endless exquisite water mist condensed from behind him, transformed into a huge treasure, shaking the sky and the earth. The huge treasure behind Bian Zi far behind at this moment also slammed into Sword Tianhe. Fight between the two. He roared out, covered in a thin mist of blood. The originally unstoppable kendo Tianhe was actually shaken at this moment, and it was difficult to advance even more. Bian Ziyuan laughed wildly. A pair of eyes looked at Jian Wushuang savagely, as if he was about to break his body into pieces in the next moment. And the long river of swordsmanship that tore through the sky and pointed at the temple of heaven, at this moment began to give birth to fine cracks. It seems that it may collapse at any time. Standing in the center of the void, Jian Wushuang, who circulated 3 great paths of luck on the fairy body, remained calm, as if he had no feelings. Seeing this scene, he just stretched out his finger and pointed at will. The true selfless shadow behind him immediately released an unparalleled force, covering the sky of kendo. Sword Tianhe, which was likely to collapse at any time, was restored as before, and with an unimaginable general trend, he fell heavily. Bian Ziyuan's discoloration changed drastically, and before he could make any response, he was covered under the Tianhe River. The huge water mist treasure behind him finally couldn't hold on, and was completely broken. Facing the heavenly temple that stood in Tianlu for an unknown number of years, the unspeakable kendo Tianhe fell down. Bian Ziyuan's figure dressed in a blood dance was finally annihilated in the sword Tianhe. Boom! The heaven and land formed by the accumulation of Yinxian bones were directly divided into 2 under this sword, and the heavenly hall was finally broken. With the shattered temple as the center, the shattered blocks quickly sank into the endless sea. Endless black water gushes out from every crack, swallowing every piece of land. Under this sword, even rank 6 Dian Immortal had no chance of surviving. He was so desperate that the black robe envoys who were watching from afar were more or less affected, and his expression was miserable. To the extreme. They never imagined that a little evangelist would reach such a shocking level. First, the emperor was cut off by his hand, almost dissipated from the fairy source, and his soul disappeared. And then the great Tianguan Bianzi was cut down by the Kendo Tianhe. At this moment, under the broken sky, only more than 200 of them were left in black robe. But facing a Jian Wushuang, even letting them dare to step forward, is already shocked. As the temple of heaven shattered, the plane of heaven and land was divided into two, and everything was on the verge of destruction. Jian Wushuang's true eyes swept across slowly, and all the black robe envoys he was looking at would retreat and retreat, seemingly likely to flee at any time. Although he was soaked with divine mind by the way of killing, he didn't lose control, and knew that Tianlu could not stay for long. Once these 200 black robes were organized, it would be difficult for Jian Wushuang to deal with it. Dian Immortal and Yanxian are quite different. Even if Jian Wushuang can kill Dian Immortal across the border, what about the 10 or the 100 that can be killed? How about 200? It is already an unimaginable thing. Even though he has 3 great roads on his back, he is still an immortal. This is an unchangeable fact. So Jian Wushuang immediately turned around and prepared to leave after slaying the Temple of Heaven. But in the next moment, a violent shot came from the extreme. He quickly turned around and directly stretched out his hand to burst out a train. The two collided, shaking the void. Immediately afterwards, in the center of the sacrificial explosion, a figure rushed out, facing Jian Wushuang and gasping for breath. At this moment, the immortal body had been broken to the extreme. His chest was almost torn apart, and the blood was constantly gushing out. Jian Wushuang recognized that this figure was Bian Ziyuan, and he realized that he had a murderous heart in his heart. "Oh, what are you doing in a daze? Today is a life-threatening pile, and you will leave him here for me. Those who dare to disobey die." Bian Ziyuan screamed frantically, frantic to the extreme. All the black robes looked at each other. They were all very nervous, and no one dared to rush forward first, because they know very well that whoever goes up first will die. There is absolutely no chance of survival. Bian Ziyuan turned his head fiercely. A pair of eyes swept over the black robe envoys behind him. And then he dragged the broken fairy body to Jian Wushuang. Jian Wushuang's real eyes stunned, and the 7-star system between his brows began to circulate. Fairy style, a little mountain and river, accompanied by the true shadow of selflessness and the addition of 3 main roads. Everything about him is unprecedentedly terrifying. Almost at the moment when Bian Zi moved away, a huge sacred mountain rose from the void without warning and slammed forward. Bian Ziyuan roared in a low voice and directly smashed the sacred mountain with the immortal body and rushed forward unabated. At this moment, only resentment was left in his eyes. Jian Wu's eyes were as sinking as water. Facing the almost desperate Bian Ziyuan, he just stretched out his palm lightly. The next moment, 5 heavenly rivers rushed out from his palm, directly rolling forward. Bian Ziyuan was completely crazy. Facing the 5 Tianhe, he chose to fight. But soon he discovered that the immortal style he released had been swallowed directly, and he didn't even have the ability to resist. Facing the roaring Tianhe, he was left weak. 5 Tianhe directly trapped his limbs and shattered his fairy body in an instant. As long as Jian Wushuang was willing, he could be beheaded instantly. But he didn't do that. Instead, he retracted his palm and pulled Bianzi far in front of him. At this moment, Bianzi was far away, almost reaching the edge of dying. His blood eyes were completely dimmed, but he still stared at Jian Wushuang frantically, as if he wanted to peel him off. The reason Jian Wushuang didn't kill him was because he thought that Bian Ziyuan had saved his life when he was hunted down earlier. "Don't make trouble, I will let you go," Jian Wushuang said solemnly, his words full of supreme authority. Chapter 4961. Jian Wushuang frowned slightly. He felt the threat of hatred from Bian Ziyuan's words. As for threats, his approach is to completely kill them. But at this moment, Jian Wushuang had no intention of doing it. Seeing that the fairy body had been completely broken, and Bian Ziyuan, who was no longer able to fight, moved his compassionate heart. "It'll save your life, you can go," Jian Wushuang said in a deep voice, and then he was about to throw it away. Hearing this, Bian Ziyuan smiled weirdly. Do you think that you really want to take this seat? I'm afraid you haven't understood the gap between Yanxian and Dianxian. Hearing these words, Jian Wushuang's heart suddenly felt a sense of crisis. It seemed that it was precisely to confirm what he was thinking that Bian Ziyuan, which had already reached the edge of death, suddenly surged with a terrible suction. The 5 heavenly rivers that had clamped him down at this moment actually languished, and they madly conveyed strength to Bian Ziyuan's body. Jian Wu has a huge change in double-sided color, and he feels the extreme strength in his body, which is madly passing. The source of the passage is actually on Bian Ziyuan. The immortal body was already on the verge of death, and the immortal body was far away. At this moment, the immortal body began to fill up quickly. The broken fairy body was refilled, and even the realm was restored. Incredible. However, within a short span of tens of breaths, Jian Wushuang's energy was swallowed by more than half, and he couldn't control it at all. He never expected that Bian Ziyuan could swallow it, without any conditions. The face of Bian Ziyuan, where his arms were reborn, was full of madness. His 2 newly born arms directly clamped Jian Wushuang, and began to swallow even more crazily. This seat has reminded you a long time ago. If you don't kill this seat, you will definitely regret it, and then you will completely integrate into this seat's body. Bian Ziyuan smiled gloomily, because the strength of Jian Wushuang's immortal body was so majestic and vast that cracks appeared in his new fairy body. After this seat completely swallows you, you will have to see how you, a little fairy, can have the power to shake Dian. Jian Wu Duan was feeling cold. The next moment the Wu Wu Zhening behind him suddenly opened his eyes. Facing the far side, he slammed his palm down. Boom! The sky was shattered. And Bian Ziyuan didn't notice the blow on the head, due to the devouring too much. By the time he reacted, it was already too late, and his entire figure was blasted out of 100 feet, and the recoverable fairy body was almost shattered. Jian Wushuang stepped back a few steps. His face turned pale. If he didn't stop him in time, I'm afraid Bian Ziyuan would be able to swallow him completely. With the passage of a large amount of Yanli, the avenues that rely heavily on Yanli, such as the true shadow of the selfless and the way of killing, began to fall into a deep sleep. This made him fall into a great passivity. Bian Ziyuan, who had completely recovered now, waved his hand to wipe the blood from the corner of his mouth, and looked at Jian Wushuang with a grinning grin. It really didn't happen to me that such a terrible energy would be contained in a small eternal fairy. I only absorbed dozens of breaths of time, and it was able to completely recover me. I have to say that you are a terrible existence. Now I can't wait to swallow you completely. Presumably you are the opportunity for me to break through rank 9. Listening to his voice, Jian Wushuang completely disgusted in his heart, and the last bit of pity before disappeared. He took a step forward and said coldly, "Want to swallow me? It depends on whether you can survive." "Oh, I want to see how you hold me to death." Bian Ziyuan laughed. The next moment he suddenly raised his arms, with supreme terrifying power, directly grasped more than a dozen black robe envoys, and threw them at Jian Wushuang. These black robe envoys that had been grasped burst into blood mist in the air, and the cover pressed forward. The boundless blood mist swallowed, and the sword was cold with no double-sided color. In his palm, the invisible sword was recondensed, and the blood mist was cut away. Seeing the far side of this scene, he turned his head coldly, and looked at more than 200 black robe envoys behind him. "If you don't leave again, I don't mind swallowing all of you, or turning into blood mist." Panic appeared in the eyes of all the black robe envoys, and they had already seen the far-reaching thunder cold-blooded methods. If they didn't do what he said, the end would definitely be miserable. Anyway, it's death, it's better to fight. The black robe clerk gritted his teeth, and rushed directly to Jian Wushuang. There is the first, there is the second, and the third. After a while, all the black robe envoys rushed toward Jian Wushuang like locusts. Looking at the black robe envoy in the sky, Jian Wushuang quickly took out 2 emperor pin pills, and stuffed them into the entrance, preparing to release his strong sword. However, when the 2D pin pills completely turned into medicine and flowed into the limbs, he suddenly coughed out a large mouthful of divine blood. and then his breath was wilted. Originally, the true shadow of selflessness and the way of killing were asleep, but now the only way of guarding and the way of Wuxuang's sword are completely withered. I thought it would be able to stabilize the situation with the Emperor Pin Pill, but the immortal body could no longer sustain this consumption. At this moment, not to mention using a Zeon sword, even Wuxuang Kendo can't be used. The black robe that rushed over made the sword retreat several tens of feet without double-clicking. Then, as if he had discovered something, he hurriedly shouted with excitement. He is already at the end of the crossbow, and everyone is going to be able to kill him. All the black robe ambassadors suddenly went crazy after hearing this. You must know that whoever can kill Jian Wuxuang will be able to take up the post of Zhao Xiangguan. As long as he can be in the position of Zhao Xiangguan, he can share a trace of the Emperor's aura, which is enough to make every black robe envoy completely crazy. Jian Wuxuang, who was already at the end of the crossbow, faced the full blow of more than 200 black robe envoys, and he was already unable to recover. All kinds of immortal styles the treasure cap pressed down. He couldn't bear it, and he vomited blood. Watching this scene far from afar, he showed a grinning grin. In his opinion, the complete destruction of Jian Wuxuang was a matter of settled matter. Just ask in this heaven land, and even the entire borderless sea, who can block so many immortal styles of the three-turn Dian Immortal. Chapter 4962. Under the sound of such majestic anger, all the black robes stopped the movements in their hands for a moment. The passage of time seemed to slow down. Bian Ziyuan only felt that the speed of the blood flowing in the fairy body had frozen. The air dropped to freezing point, and everything was full of dead silence and cold. Then, the void quietly rippled at this moment. Immediately afterwards, thousands of white light soared intent, like a blooming lotus platform, fully stretched. And in the center of this sword intent, there are two figures standing. One man and one woman. The middle-aged man cleans his face without beard, is extraordinary heroic, and has long hair dancing in the wind. And the heroic aura exuded by that woman was enough to overwhelm her own beauty, and when her black gold dress perfectly set off her figure, it was extremely mysterious. They each carried 6 long swords on their waists, full of majesty that could not be seen directly. What flows around them is not the strength, but the pure sword intent. The whole shattered void seemed to be silent at this moment, and all the black robe envoys subconsciously looked at these two uninvited guests. A wisp of cold sweat flows from the far sideburns, and the horror of life and death that gushes out of his heart is caused by these two. Besieged by the black robe at the very center, Jian Wuxuang, who was already at the end of the crossbow, and could destroy the immortal body at any time, finally showed a wry smile after looking at the two figures. Yan Fan first raised his eyebrows and smiled, then was completely angry. You guys dare to hurt my disciple? Is your life too long? Feeling that the coldness around him has completely disappeared, and the black robe made him speak wildly with dissatisfaction, and directly urged himself to suppress the past. Jumping beam clown. Yan Fan sneered, looking at the black robe envoy who was about to rush. He didn't even bother to pull out the sword. At the next moment, a subtle sword intent emerged from the lotus platform under Yin Hu's feet, directly slashing forward. A shocking scene appeared. The black robe emissary who was running at extreme speed, the fairy body was instantly fragmented and miserably scattered in the void. Everything seemed like it had never happened before, extremely silent. Good apprentice, leave it to your teacher next. Step out in one step. Thousands of sword intents spread across the wild. Yan Fan laughed loudly and flew directly towards Jian Wuxuang with Jiang Li. Bian Ziyuan shouted in disbelief. Hurry up and stop them, and kill them all at this time, not leaving one. With the issuance of this order, more than 200 black robe droves all frantically surrounded Jiang Liyan and returned. Facing the terrifying power that came over the sky, these two true sword immortals all smiled quietly, as if they were contempt. In the next moment, the void was completely replaced by a diamond-shaped light curtain. The boundless sword curtain fell down. This sword curtain is a sword that can easily kill 100,000 dead immortals under the sea of blood, and it is a sword that Jian Wushuang has to deal with all his strength. As for the fate of these black robe envoys, when the two sword immortals appeared on the stage, they had already been completely determined. The sword curtain fell silently, and everything was a foregone conclusion. All the black robe envoys who were preparing to fight with all their strength only felt that their eyes suddenly lit up, and then their heads turned around. They are without exception. More than 200 black robe envoys died directly. The death was only in an instant, and even the bones of the immortal body were turned into residues, scattered in the void, and turned into stars. Apprentice, it's not too late for the teachers. Yan Fan and Jiangli descended directly in front of Jian Wushuang and said with a smile. Jian Wu was pale on both sides, and then he folded his hands and said, "Thank you two seniors for coming to help. The juniors are grateful." Yan Fan stretched out his hand and put down his palm, and said in a condensed voice, "You don't need to say thank you between you and me." Jian Wushuang smiled bitterly. "Actually, you don't have to come here to take risks." When Yan Fan heard it, he immediately slapped his chest and said, "If you are a master and can't even protect your disciple, it's better to die. What's more, the disciple is trapped by this group of salted fish. I am afraid that only these two sword immortals would dare to call hundreds of rank 3 Dian immortals salted fish awful." Jiangli, who had rarely spoken for a long time, spoke at this moment, his domineering extreme. "Apprentice, who else wants to kill? Let us solve it together, so as not to leave troubles." Jian Wushuang did not speak, but subconsciously looked forward. There, far away from the edge of the sword curtain, when he saw Jian Wushuang, he cast his eyes, almost standing unstable, and fell into the void. Bian Ziyuan was still in the horrible scene just now and never recovered. More than 200 black robe envoys, that is, more than 200 third-ranked Dian immortals, all died strangely. I am afraid that the 9th-ranked Dian immortal came. This is impossible. But at this moment it all happened. All of them died in an instant, and all the secrets of the temple completely disappeared. He who has no support, his face pale. "Hey, I even let go of a guy, so we'll solve it easily," Yan Fan said in a low voice, with his palm quietly placed on the hilt of his waist. Rank 6 Dian immortal didn't seem to be worth his sword, but in order to make a quick battle, Yan Fan still drew out a snowflake-long sword. The void suddenly dropped to the freezing point. Even after hundreds of feet away, Bian Ziyuan still felt the blood clotting. He was extremely convinced that he couldn't stop this sword at all. So he made a decisive decision. Almost at the same time that Yan Fan drew his sword, he directly used both palms and fingers to tear open blood stains in front of his chest. Divine blood spurted directly from the blood marks on his chest, and then dripped into the void. The next moment, the originally dead and broken heaven and land plane suddenly surged, with all kinds of extremely powerful forces. Then, a body shaped like a streamer rose from the plane of heaven and land, and came to Bian Ziyuan's side. In just a few dozen breaths of time, turned out to be a gathering of hundreds of Dian immortals, and a steady stream of Dian immortals flew up from the plane of heaven and land. They were all very thirsty and bloody, and their red eyes surrounded the far side. Bian Ziyuan stepped back and pointed in Jian Wushuang's direction, and said grimly, "As long as you take down the 3 of them, the blood in my body, including the blood of the Emperor, can be supplied to you. What are you waiting for? Let's go together." All the bloodthirsty Dian immortals were completely crazy, and rushed towards Jian Wushuang, without any hesitation at this moment. Yan Fan smiled compassionately. All beings are equal under the sword in his hand. However, at this moment, Jian Wushuang, who was fully absorbed, only felt a fire in his chest. Then before he could react, a completely black bead, as if receiving some kind of induction, flew directly out of his arms and went straight to the void. That completely black bead. Jian Wushuang saw that it was exactly the black bead he found from the 6-day realm, the first one of the next 3 days, under the Black Abyss prison. Chapter 4963. Since this black bead was found by him, it has been lying peacefully in his arms, without any vision. Except that the three emperors Zhenying was very wary of him. This black bead no longer had a sense of existence. However, it was this black bead that had no sense of existence, but at this moment drilled out of Jian Wushuang's arms and flew into the void. Its speed is so fast that it even surpasses Yan Fan. What is this? Yan Fan was puzzled, and the palm of the sword's hilt also relaxed. But under this chaotic and broken sky, above the broken plane of heaven and land, no one Dayan would care about such a small black bead. The Dayan immortals who were bewitched by the blood flowing out of Bian Ziyuan rushed towards Jian Wushuang from all directions. As the Tianlu plane fell into an irreversible split and fall, all the Dayan immortals trapped in the Tianlu regained their freedom at this moment. That kind of weird barrier that shrouded heaven and land disappeared, and nearly half of Dayan immortals, regardless of the horror of the borderless sea, flying or swimming, escaped from heaven and land. Nearly half of the Dayan immortal, all rushed into the void at this moment. Crazy. These Dayan immortals sinking into the endless sea were once the strongest in control of the battlefield. But after countless years, they have fallen and become bloodthirsty monsters. And almost at the same time, when Tianlu was cut into two pieces by Jian Wushuang, a giant beast suddenly emerged from the water in the not-so-distant borderless sea. He seemed to have just been awakened from a deep sleep, and 9 huge heads that looked like a big sun looked at the plane of heaven and land that was about to fall at the same time. Then the giant beast coveted, and after a brief thought, he plunged directly into the sea and headed towards the broken heaven and land. At this moment, hundreds of Dayan immortals rushed towards Jian Wushuang frantically. Jiang Liliu raised his eyebrows and directly stopped Jian Wushuang behind him, and then rushed to Yan back to say loudly, "What are you still doing in a daze? A quick decision." Yan Fan nodded, facing the overwhelming Dayan immortals, ready to cut a sword. Only Jian Wushuang stared at the black bead rotating in the void, and he felt that something terrible would happen next. As if to confirm his thoughts, the black beads that kept spinning in the void scattered hundreds of millions of gleams in the next moment. This kind of faint light showed a weird black and purple, like a wave, instantly spreading across the entire void. Almost at the moment when the black and purple light fell, Jian Wushuang felt a kind of tremor. Uncontrollable trembling. This tremor is like a real feeling of powerlessness, even beyond the powerless feeling of facing the emperor. Jian Wushuang felt that the strength in his body was trembling, and he was slightly dizzy in his mind. Jiang Lian returned to the two sword immortals with the same symptoms. Their expressions changed drastically, and they looked directly at the spinning black bead. At this moment, all the crazy Dayan immortals began to release all kinds of terrifying immortal styles, and the violent force spread. But the horrible scene appeared. Almost the instant when the power spread out, it was disintegrated and swallowed by the hundreds of millions of ghost lights cast by the black beads. Hundreds of immortal styles enough to destroy any heaven, and Yanli were all disintegrated and shattered. Then the whole body was covered with Yanli's Dayan immortal. The immortal body gushed out the blood at a speed visible to the naked eye, and in a short moment, it became a corpse directly, nearly more than 300 Dayan immortals. Only at this moment, the fairy source burst into pieces, and the immortal body turned into a corpse. The boundless black and purple light is still piercing through the earth, wherever it can be enveloped. Yanli is disintegrated and swallowed. Dayan immortal is also drained from the source of the immortal, and turned into a corpse. Jian Wushuang had turned pale. He seemed to have realized something, and turned back to Jiang Lian and said, "Don't release Yanli, nothing at all." Jiang Li nodded heavily. She and Yan Fan were not directly beheaded under this faint light, most likely because they did not release any power. Yan Fan's face was also a little pale. Even though he had seen too many tragic battles, it was the first time he had seen such a strange scene. What exactly was that black bead? And the faint light that radiated from it was able to swallow all the approaching Dayan immortal in an instant. At the same time, Yan Fan also had an inexplicable intuition. If he had just released Yanli instead of Jianni, he would probably end up not much better than those Dayan immortals. Under the sky covered by hundreds of millions of looming rays of light, all the dying immortals that released their power were directly sucked into corpses, without even a bit of fairy rhyme. Bian Ziyuan had already been shocked out of his body. Almost at the same time that all dying immortals had died, he turned around and fled. However, he was still a step late in the end, and he subconsciously released his strength. Those dark and purple light rays are like Tarsus maggots, directly enclosing his entire fairy body. Ugh! He screamed in shock. The fairy body was wilting at a speed visible to the naked eye, and the fairy source was instantly shattered. Facing the shattered temple, Bian Ziyuan finally turned into a handful of flying ash and disappeared completely. This scene was completely captured by Jian Wushuang. He did not expect Bian Ziyuan to die in such a rush. It was an unexpected battle, but it ended directly after the appearance of this black bead. Jian Wushuang and Jiang Lian returned to the three, standing quietly in place under the shroud of this light. No one dared to do anything. That unknown Yugong possesses the power to harvest any dying immortal. With the complete death of dying immortal, hundreds of millions of Huamang came and went quickly, and immediately returned to the black beads. Then the black bead turned into a dark meteor, and got into Jian Wushuang's arms at an unimaginable speed. Jian Wu had cold hands and feet, almost sat in the void. Since coming to Dianhuan, he has never had a moment of horror like this moment. The black bead with unknown power was really too terrifying. It would be easy to kill any dying immortal's ability easily, and it would be easy to kill Jian Wushuang. And he finally knew why the true soul of the three emperors was so nervous at the beginning. Jian Wushuang now regrets it very much. This black bead is simply an extremely unstable factor. If he releases a bit of power fluctuation, will he be directly killed? Something ran past, gang. Where's the black bead just now? Chapter 4964. That kind of weird and inexplicable light disappeared, and Yen Fan dared to leave after another while. Madam, you know who made the move just now. I think in this borderless sea, there will be no more than one hand that can arouse the terrible power just now. Jiangli shook his head. The two of us have been sleeping under the sea of blood for too long, and we don't know who else will enter here later. That's really weird. Fortunately, our husband and wife have always been cutting grass and roots, leaving no immortals under the sword, and there will not be any opponents who can't get through with us. Yen Fan scratched his head and said, and then heaved a sigh of relief when he saw Jian Wushuang also safe and sound. The apprentice is fine, otherwise he will die. Jiang Libai glanced at him. Idiot! If you made a quick decision just now, why did you cause so much trouble? You will get rid of your verbose problems in the future. I'm not long-winded. It's a good way to attack the heart. The best way to kill the enemy is to attack the heart. Yen Fan talked freely. Seeing them bickering, Jian Wushuang also slowly recovered from the shock, and then stretched his hand into his arms as if he was dead. When the finger touched the black bead, there was no horrible suction power as imagined, only a warm and cool meaning, as if it had never recovered. It's really strange, how did this black bead get awakened? Jian Wushuang thought. But soon, Yen Fan interrupted his thoughts. Apprentice, what are you going to do next? I want to hear your thoughts as a teacher. Withdrawing his thoughts, facing Yen Fan's verbal advantage, Jian Wushuang just smiled bitterly in his heart, but did not stop it. I came here to find a friend, and then I will continue to look for it. When Yen Fan heard this, he continued to smile. Then we will protect you on the next journey. Jiang Li also nodded. With us by your side, this endless sea will never threaten you anymore. It's not so good. Jian Wushuang scratched his head. Somehow he didn't know how to refuse. It's natural and righteous for the master to protect the apprentice. If it's good or not, you can come over. Yen Fan laughed, and took Jian Wushuang directly and flew forward. Jiang Li also raised his eyebrows and smiled, seemingly satisfied with his husband's domineering, and then followed him. From this we can see a magical scene. Two sword celestial beings crossed the borderless sea, with a shivering little yin xian in between. Almost at the same time they left the heaven and land plane, they slowly walked out of the shattered temple. This figure is exactly the young man who was previously beheaded by Jian Wushuang with a single sword. He walked slowly in the heaven and land plain that had been in ruins. His face was without sadness or joy, as if everything here was not his. In the end, he walked in the center position after the war, and then his arms snapped. Suddenly, a unique energy fluctuation of several points began to gather in the void. As this energy fluctuation kept gathering, the originally broken void began to change. One after another, huamang, which looked like broken stars, began to appear, and then quickly intertwined and connected. With the intertwining of these stars and brilliance, a fairy source shattered, and the figure that could not die again appeared again. That is far away. Thousands of flowing clouds and water patterns flowed slowly, covering the edges of his body. Suddenly opened his eyes at this moment. The unspeakable general situation filled the void, and thunder snakes shuttled through the clouds. In the end, when his figure was completely condensed, the young man retracted his arms. His face was so pale that there was no blood. The boundless trend finally dissipated, and the distant figure fell heavily on the ground. Chapter 4965. Jian Wushuang heard some clues and asked, "That place is dangerous?" "Disciple, no matter how dangerous this endless sea is, as long as we are by your side, no one can help you." Yin Fan patted him on the shoulder. "It's just that the place is not dangerous, but rather strange." Jiangli smiled coldly at this time, and a pair of Yingmu almost killed Yin Hui to pieces. "It's weird. I'm afraid it's an unforgettable old relationship." Yin Fan twitched at the corner of his mouth, and then said awe-inspiringly, "Madam, what are you talking about? Don't mention the old things. I've already broken up with the past." Jiangli snorted coldly, and the six-handed long sword slung around his waist screamed, "It doesn't matter if you can't forget it. I will cut it off for you with one sword and one sword. Disciple, go quickly, it shouldn't be too late." Yin Fan left these words and flew out first. Jian Wushuang smiled bitterly. It seems that this cheap master still carries a lot of old love debts. In any case, his originally hanging heart also settled down a bit. Finding with a goal is far better than looking aimlessly. The sea of boundlessness is endless, boundless, and it is difficult for everything to float above it. Only the bones of Yin Xian can float on it. And the previous mighty heaven and land plain was completely composed of Yin Xian bones. As he continued to move forward, various planes of different sizes appeared in Jian Wushuang's eyes. There is not much difference between a seating area and the universe of Wuyanzi overseas. Here is simply a small universe. And as they move forward, there are various vicious and unopened Dayan immortals who want to kill them. Regrettably, if Jian Wushuang were alone, he would naturally retreat. After all, rank 6 Dayan immortal could already make him drink a pot. But now there are 2 sword immortals escorting them. Even if it is rank 6 Dayan immortal, Yin Fan, who is walking in the forefront, does not bother to draw a sword. He can even shred any rank 6 Dayan immortal with just one finger and his unmatched sword intent. Source: there are already dozens of tier 6 Dayan immortals who have traveled for hundreds of millions of miles. And the number of tier 6 Dayan immortals who have died under Yan's hands is nearly 100. On the one hand, Jian Wushuang had a bit of unfathomable strength in the frightened Yan's return. On the other hand, he was frightened by how many Dayan immortals had been banished by Zhen Wuyang Emperor. It's no wonder that there are so few Dayanxians in the Desiyu nowadays, and the co-authors have been banished into the sea of endless years ago. So far, the lowest level in this borderless sea is Dayan immortal. Jian Wushuang guessed that countless immortals were exiled here. But Yin Xian's fate may not be too good. As we continue to move forward, the plane of the endless sea gradually disappears, and is replaced by endless cold and dead silence. Jian Wushuang felt Daiking's breath as much as possible, hoping to find it as soon as possible. And a pair of old gods in Yanfan gradually became a little dignified as they continued to move forward. A pair of heroic eyes began to look around. A tree. How could a tree grow in this sea of no edge? Seeing the extremely weird scene in front of him, Jian Wushuang was a little surprised. Because in front of him, Trees almost as high as the sky appeared on the originally endless Black Sea. The trees are tall, with only stretched branches and no leaves. They do not look like some kind of fairy tree. In Jian Wushuang's fascination, everything in his body changed, and Jiang Li and Yin Fan had quietly disappeared at this moment. Well, another illusion? Jian Wushuang frowned slightly, and he almost immediately realized that he was already in an illusion. Is it because I saw those trees? Being able to make him fall into the illusion in this short moment. The fairy cultivator who laid this illusion did have some skills, but it encountered Jian Wushuang who could see through it at a glance. Immediately afterwards, just as he was about to use the invisible sword to cut open the illusion in front of him, a snowflake-long sword took him one step ahead and directly opened a crack in the illusion. Then a big palm pulled Jian Wushuang out of the illusion. Good fellow, you dare to cast the illusion in front of this seat. I think you are impatient to live. Yin Fan was full of anger, and when he was about to do it, Jiang Li took a step ahead of him and directly stretched out his hand and shook it. In an instant, the entire illusion was shattered, and then a huge ball of hair was pinched by Jiang Li. That is a huge rabbit. Jiang Li's expression was fierce, and he was about to chop off the rabbit's head with his palm up. Madam, keep your hand! Yin Fan yelled, and rushed forward with a stride, snatching the rabbit from Jiang Li's men. What are you doing? Want to die? Jiang Li was full of anger. Yin Fan's mouth twitched, and he held the big rabbit with a smile. Here, this rabbit can't be killed, it's a friend of the old man. At this time, the big rabbit suddenly broke free from his embrace, and turned into a very agile girl in the void. Ha! The smart girl gave a faint, then turned around and ran, and soon disappeared. This dead girl. Yin Fan muttered to himself, then smiled again. Can't kill, can't kill. Jiang Li put on an expression that the old lady was too lazy to care about you, and took Jian Wushuang to leave. However, at this moment, a vague and extremely agile voice, like falling from the 9 heavens, was indescribably beautiful. Since it's all here, why don't you come and sit with me? How about recounting your old feelings? Yin Fan's complexion changed in an instant, and her lips became a little pale. Madam, hurry up. After Jiang Li heard the mellow and charming voice, his eyes almost exploded with anger, and after glaring at Yin Fan with an expression that he couldn't wait to swallow it alive, he rushed directly into the clouds of 9 heavens. My old lady didn't bother you. You dare to find my old lady. Today I will break your Guiyue immortal palace. This is the first time Jian Wushuang has seen Jiang Li draw a sword, her whole figure with endless sword intent, breaking through the sky and going straight for 9 days. Yin Fan was pale and shouted, Madam, it's getting smaller, the structure is getting smaller. Boom! 100,000 sword intent fell from the sky, almost turning him into a piece of meat. Jian Wushuang's heart was frightened, and he never expected that the 2 swordsmen had a temper, and they were actually real swords and real swords. After avoiding the 100,000 sword intent, Yin Fan looked at Jian Wushuang nervously. Quickly, quickly, she is going crazy. The 2 of us quickly stop it, otherwise we will really be upset next.